for me, the poetic allows me to be the magic, the shape-shifting kind of creature I imagine myself to be in this narrative, in this book.
It is I think it is a love letter to Trinidad in a way, and I loved writing all those moments about the land, all that lots and lots of description, having to really think about it, having to really imagine that time in history.
This is called accusation, affirmation, believing that the dogs will go to heaven.
We actually grew up on them, from Andaye to Cinderella, all have magical elements. And those are all fairy tales. And every society in the world has its very, very fairy tales. Fairy tales basically stories that you tell children that pass on the values of your society.
As if he well like he gym. Muscles for so hard, but not mager, not bony. Just them muscles in the back bunching and rippling when he moved. That was man. There's no wonder I end up in this predicament. And when he whines so, Gil, is he whine that first catch, man? I ain't gonna lie. It was he whine. He had a funny kind of whine. Music going, tang, 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 wait, tang, tang, katang, 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 and he whining the whole next beat. He had the moves correct. Knees bent, hips dipped down low, and the bottom cocked back like this. And the waist rolling like waves in maracas speech, but the timing was wrong. As if he learned to whine on the internet from watching a YouTube video, but didn't realize it had plenty different beats in soca, and he only learned one.
I kind of feel like music, you know, when you're going through a heartbreak, there's a certain song that you had that was your song for that heartbreak. It's similar for a book, you know, you're a certain stage in life. And at this stage in life, this book comes to you and it's just the right book that you can relate to, right?
Now, start now. Hello, and welcome to the Bocas Lit Zest. I am your host, Bookie Monster, Book Sessa. And today, we interpret a touching coming-of-age novel set in the Caribbean, Crack Monkey.
The first thing that begins with the culture aspect of it. Honestly, and I've been saying this for quite a while, I do not believe that enough is done in the education system to educate children about our culture.
Sergeant, Sniper Sandy reporting for service. Target in range, locked and loaded. Incapacitated, stuffed and bloated. Notice my precision to pinpoint the starving. Chew, God's bossing you. Cooking nothing. I advance and engage at your orders. Left turn, right turn, till I discover your corner. Reconnaissance, then delivery. Rapid ETA so you could EAT.
Good day, everyone. As humans, we have a complicated relationship with change. We associate it with positives such as progress and growth, and negatives such as erasure and loss. In some circumstances, we value constancy and stability. In others, we embrace disruption. These dichotomies aside, whether change is welcome or not, it invariably brings opportunity. To turn change to our advantage, we must therefore learn to recognize and leverage the opportunities that it brings. Consider, for example, the multiple waves of change buffering the world today. The COVID pandemic has upended lives, livelihoods, and economies, and is shaping the future of work and play. Equally disruptive is the climate action agenda, which requires that we make significant changes to how we produce and consume, how we move around, how we interact with the world around us. While it is easy to view these systemic changes in a negative light, as they are compelling some uncomfortable adjustments, there are many opportunities for positive growth we can choose to embrace. For us at NGC, for example, though our industry is up against a momentous challenge to reduce the carbon footprint of our operations and products, we are choosing to leverage the new market opportunities in the clean energy space to reshape the business. We have embraced a green agenda and are exploring exciting ventures and partnerships around renewable energy technologies and fuels, energy efficiency, food security, and environmental and socioeconomic sustainability. We are happy to see we are not alone in leveraging the change around us to build a stronger organization. The pandemic threw a spanner in the works for live events like NGC Bocas, but the festival has evolved into an even more dynamic, inclusive, and accessible platform for Caribbean literary voices as a result. Its virtual elements are allowing for greater participation for international literati and larger audiences. There are now more opportunities for young talent to shine through with the launch of the Youth Festival in 2021. And of course, the virtual platform allows for easier engagement and heightened visibility, which means more conversations are happening around Caribbean literature. The Bocas team has seized the opportunities created by change in its operating environment, and the festival is that much stronger as a result. It is therefore fitting that they have chosen to explore the theme of change in this year's festival, change that shaped us, change that is challenging us today, and change that we need to enact to build a safe and sustainable future for our children. We at NGC have been proud to stand with the Bocas team as title sponsors for the past 11 years of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. As always, we're excited to see what lies in store for this edition. The festival may be constantly evolving, but we are confident its reputation of excellence will remain intact, unchanged. Thank you, everyone, and have a great festival.
My daughter is immortal. Angels like immortal shade her out of the shadow of death. My daughter is immortal, strengthened by the mortar in which the last 3 years were set. She was born in a pandemic, her generation marked by the merciless, thus their births are blessed by resilience. The mother on her birth paper is resistance, her father insistent that she must survive. If this is our new normal, then they are bound to thrive in times we consider low tides. Some say last days. My daughter says she is being primed for a future where the roots of today's struggle blossoms into the awesome. So button up your suit and prepare for the Caribbean's falling fruit that will spring out of this thing that we cannot even grasp. It's just that today's struggle ends in a victory lap. If God shows us the time lapse, we will see it. From the jerky movements of struggle to the smooth transition of being stronger, better, learning to value each breath. For we have seen forevers under the influence of death on a plantation void of freedom and light. But the immortal reminds that there's salvation even after the darkest night.
Time waits for no one. Time is money. Time heals all wounds. 2022, you are a time, a future that is to come. And if when you get here, you'd be all that I have, more valuable than diamonds and rubies, both doctor and therapist for my body and soul to some degree, then I think we need to have a conversation before you come up in here with your hands swinging. This is my prayer, my request, addressed to what's coming next. And I confess, I might be singing kind of pressed, but that's because I want what's best. I want a miracle. 2022, you're not hearing me or what? You're coming through and you need to understand the assignment. There were things, thoughts, ways from the past that could blow away with the breeze. But there are some things that could remain rooted and planted like these trees for shade in times of need. For example, you could magnify the unity in communities that, whether or not you took the vaccine, you could receive from somebody's table from 6 feet, because helping your family eat is not a sin. And we don't need to post it and show it to know it, because that is just we. That is how we does deal. Well, right now, we want to bring you inside. But first, you need to sanitize and be sanctified, because God knows the truth. Some of we can't even afford to have pride after the mess over these years. So bring your broom and thing and sweep out the bad vibes and mop up the tears. Connect those who are alone and pay off 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these loans. Well, maybe that is something we could do on our own. But we want to look forward. We want to look at you, because we know that this is a comma in the sentence of this season. And yes, we appreciate the charity, but after the bellies have been filled, how we could leave the soul hungry? The people need a good word. I heard a prophet say that you are bringing manifold opportunities. And that is what I want to believe. I want to believe that you are the light at the end of the tunnel, illuminating empty classrooms and businesses, as we long for the day where we could freely build again, igniting a desire within us for knowledge, love, and peace that the darkness of ignorance and violence cannot overcome we. Well, maybe that is too much, or maybe that is not enough. And maybe there's more things we could do for we. But to put it simply, we don't want to fear you. We want to ease up. We want to bear you. We have so many past things that we could compare you to, but we want you to persevere, to be at least a happy New Year 2022. So this is your assignment. And don't mess it up.
Hi, it's been a while, it's strange. Let's see, this year I want all kinds of change, except climate change. I want change that's sweet and fruitful, like climate change. And if there's a massive tree trunk between you and that fruit, I hope your climate change. Lost your purpose last year, I hope you find a change. And when you find the change, I hope your mind the change. Diamond, emerald, and designer change. And when you have the change, I hope you share the change. Remember last year you couldn't spare the change, you know? I want the world to grow. I want us to learn from things we didn't know in the past year. I want the last year to be the last year we broadcast fear. I want more lives to be saved from Facebook than there are lives on Facebook. I don't want Facebook to be the only book people read. I want more IQ than IG in 2022. Artists gonna have more platforms to perform in 2022. I pray people stop performing on platforms, and it's plenty too. But we could do it. Turn banger season into Poey blossom. If we truly force some, we could form some. Forge love in the land we're forged from. Said if we truly force some, we could form some. Forge love in the land we're forged from. Liberty. I hope we guillotine every big-headed decision that's killing we. Cut off our nose if we smell fear. Because if it took a L there, then that L's there. Last year was hell, but this year we give him hell. Yeah? Yeah.
Point of view. You're the new year long awaited to be born. But as of midnight, December 31st, your birth evokes mixed emotions. And you're welcomed by the world with a bittersweet tone. Our embrace tastes deceitful, our compliments hit you like a stone because beneath all our oohs and ahs are all wounds and scars, and it's hard to just embrace you with open arms. And you can sense the resistance, how we are reminiscent, and you too can still smell the scent of disappointment and sadness that lingers in the air from the past year, where men drop like flies, coronavirus on a rise, violence and crime, natural disaster, after, oh, what a time to be alive, we ponder. When lives are cut shorter and shorter. Point of view. You're the new year many fallen soldiers will never meet. When called to attention that death is sour, then life is sweet. And for those who have a new leaf to turn, you come bearing gifts. No promises what they hold, but that's what makes you beautiful. The way you unfold is determined by us. January, February, March, April, May come and go just like optimistic and hopeful, nothing different. Until we make the difference. If we, like a flower, would more than survive rain but use it to be empowered, then the showers of climate change, gender-based and race violence, unemployment, infringement of the rights of children, flaws in the justice system, poverty, inequality, gang activity will fuel us to take action and be advocates and assist in cease and desist, decrease and dismiss. Point of view. You're the new year where we don't rely on a new year to make everything magically better. Where we are purposeful, forgetters, intentional, go-getters, calculated, trendsetters, and even better, faith-driven. So when our passion is not prepared for the pressure and our force just can't cover the area, we remember that there is hope above. Point of view. You're the new year where we have the serenity to change, to accept the things we can't change, the courage to change the things we can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Point of view.
I had a dream. Not a Martin Luther King type theme, but more spiritual type scene. Like a movie premiere, you know, never before seen. Where the director who directs the direction of this story is far from ordinary. Tasked with the social responsibility, not to be social. Rarely witness where shared experience manifests to a plateau of global. How long can oppression continue to reign while we unwillingly dance in the rain? Becoming uninspired, sick and tired of discrimination, inequality and injustice. It's not just this, when hands must be sanitized but hearts are left desensitized. When would we awaken a love that's never on cruise control, purifies the soul and ultimately heals the world? Hello TV land. If you're listening to this now, then you're blessed. You have lost many loved ones. It's 2022. Pavement Poets is here to stay. Yeah. Excuse me, Mr. Man, I heard you like AC, you're not a spoken word fan, but my lyrics blow minds like a Lasco brat. Wait, no, a Lasco fan. Don't you understand as I stand next to this microphone stand with no mic in my hand? My words bring more heat to a lamb. Wait, what? Yeah, spinning by the gyro, man. I don't repeat myself, so I'm not a hype man. Don't look for forward, cause I'm not a mic man. If you're looking for love, then I'm not your type, man. Don't you understand that a man is just a man? Until it's time to check up on your prostate gland. But if you like fairy tales, I could be your Peter Pan. We'll fly so high that you never, never land. No. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. No fancy sound system in this hard time. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. And the only thing to lose is our mind. Yes, it's a recession. That don't stop a session. Why you so upset? Do you have indigestion? So what you came first? You use a discretion. I left last. Impressions. Have several seats over in that section. Can't usher you, that's my confession. Think I've been tricked. This is not a treat. You came to beat bucks, but the bucks done beat like a tenderized meat. Sprawl up on the street. Crime scene, yellow tape, white sheet. Don't promote violence, but the beat lashing. Human beatbox with the beat matching. Can't stop the vibe, once the vibe catching. All natural song, no weave scratching. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. No fancy sound system in this hard time. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. And the only thing to lose is our minds. Find me in a fat box bent like Smeagol, building up a sweat, wet like seagull. Hands waving faster than Steven Seagal. Once is carnival, you bound to seagull. No. See woman sweet like a mango. Some independent don't need a man. Always cover themselves like a poncho. Not afraid to ask for D. Django. Ability to play heartstrings like a banjo. Only takes two tonight to tango. Willing to get dirty for me? Commando. Knows how to go down south. Sando. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. No fancy sound system in this hard time. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. Going back to basics, no sophisticated lines. And the only thing to lose is our minds. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. That's why I'm bringing back the playground rhymes. When the only thing to lose is our minds.
Drop your bow, Mr. Fiddler. Oh, ha, hi. This country so colorful and truly diverse. We're doing our best to put TNT first. Youth success through advancement, we encourage. We proudly supporting the rich cultural heritage, promoting development in the sporting arena, and empowering women for equality of gender. We sustaining the environment and strengthening the society. First citizens helping paint a brighter TNT. Drag your bow, Mr. Fiddler.
One Caribbean Media renews its support of the Bocas Lit Fest with sponsorship of the 2022 Bocas Lit Prize. As the festival journeys further into its second decade, we recognize the tremendous effort and innovation that has gone into fostering a community of Caribbean readers, writers, and mentors. As this community grows, we take pride in recognizing the excellence of its members and do not hesitate to support their development through this continued partnership.
The Guyanese activist Andaye was a transformative figure. Published soon after her death, her book, The Point Is to Change the World, collects Andaye's writings on the intersections of gender, race, and class. Now, scholar activists Carol Boyce Davies, Honor Ford Smith, and Suniti Miraj join editor Alyssa Trotz for a conversation about Andaye's legacies for today's Caribbean. Part of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest's 4 Days to Change the World.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we didn't actually realize we were on air. Welcome. This is part of the transition. There is Honor. We were testing on another platform and then came over onto this one. So we're beginning in true Bacchanal style, but we are here. Over to you, Honor.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Point is to Change the World, a forum on the legacies of Andaye. I'm delighted to be the moderator of this panel and to be joined here by three amazing women. Carol Boyce Davies, who is the Frank H.T. Rhodes Professor of Humane Letters and also the Professor of Africana Studies and Literatures in English at Cornell University. Those of you who know Carol will know that she has written several texts on Black women and writing, and she's also produced an amazing book called To the Left of Karl Marx, which is a political autobiography or political biography of the Black communist Claudia Jones. Suniti Maharaj is a journalist, and I like to think of her also as the person who runs the Caribbean Yard Campus, an initiative designed to bridge informal and formal knowledge systems of the Caribbean. She's also the managing director of the Lloyd Best Institute of the University of the West Indies. And on top of all of that, she runs her own multimedia production company. My name is Anna Ford Smith, and I'm associate professor in cultural and artistic practices for environmental and urban justice at York University, and I'm also an associate director of the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean at York University. Last but definitely not least, my colleague Alisa Trotz is professor of Caribbean Studies at New College, and she's also the director of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. But most importantly, today, she's the editor of the anthology that we're going to be talking about. The Point is to Change the World, Selected Writings by Andaye. And for the last 14 years, Alisa has also run a weekly column in the Guyanese daily, the Starbrook Times. I think it comes out on a Monday, and it's easily one of the best columns that you can read in the region. I wanted to start by taking a quick detour into the book itself. At the very start of the book, The Point is to Change the World, Andaye explains exactly who the book is meant for. She says it's meant for folks who want to change the world, who want to overturn the power relations which are embedded in every unequal facet of our lives. At a time when right-wing populism is on the rise and when discussions of the redistribution of wealth seem to have dropped off of most people's agenda, when environmental crisis is literally threatening to engulf our region, and when violence in all its multiple forms, slow, spectacular, and gender-based, is a constant challenge, Andaye reminds us in her work what it means to fight together across difference for a just and inclusive politics that honors the discredited wisdom and resilience of the most marginalized in our societies. Andaye was a lifelong activist, but as everybody who knew her understands, she was able to present struggles for justice not as spectacular acts of heroism or even of courage, and certainly not of salvation, but just as an ordinary part of being alive and being human. She used the term organized in a particular sense, in the sense that Olive, in a way that Olive Senior might put it. She might say that Andaye existed in a condition of resonance. That is, her organizational work took place in a context where what you say has to be heard and taken up and answered by somebody else. It was a kind of call and response as a sort of technique of organization. And she built movements. She built the Working People's Alliance. She built Red Thread. She built the Guyanese Cancer Society. She participated in the formation, very critically always, of the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. And she built all these organizations from the bottom up in a particular democratic style that differed from the liberal individualism that we have inherited from colonial powers. I want to ask Carol to start us off by talking a little bit about Andaye's style of organization and by relating it to the work that you have done on the Black radical tradition and the Caribbean feminist tradition, and kind of put in context the work that Andaye did. I can't hear.
Got it. Hi, everybody, and greetings. And I see some names of people I know already showing up on the chat, so I'm really happy. My field is literature, so I am not going to go into all the activist dimensions of Andaye. If you don't mind, I'd love to talk about how she fits into the spectrum of Caribbean women's writing. And one of the things I want to say, first of all, and by way of congratulating the editor, Alyssa Trott, says this is probably one of the quickest access points we have to the work of a Caribbean intellectual. That's the way I want to go with this. In other words, normally we wait another 50 years until somebody rediscovers this person, and then somebody writes a biography, and then we begin to see how come we didn't know about them and so on. In the Andaye case, and in this particular case, and I think it's largely because she herself was really definitive about making sure that she would be heard into the future, and that her work would not be lost, really took charge in many ways of making sure her ideas circulated. So this is actually one of the first collections from my studies of Caribbean women's writing that appeared this quickly after the passing of the person. So technically it makes us feel that she hasn't really passed. We still have a sort of continuance as far as she is concerned, because we now have her work moving into the future. And I say this because for those of us like me who have spent a big chunk of our academic life working on Caribbean women's writing, we have uncovered quite a bit of the legacy. And of course, it's still both ways, that you discover on both ends, new writings and rediscovered writings. For example, the whole area of Caribbean women's narratives of enslavement and freedom, we still hope that many more will show up in different contexts. And I know people are working on those. But basically, we've done quite a good job in identifying the sort of literary history of Caribbean women's writing, the creative work, the Jean Reeses, making sure that there's a really full coverage of that kind of work. All of the writers, the Una Marsons, the range. I see Rhoda. Hi, Rhoda. So essentially, we've done a good job, I think, of accounting for that range. But one of the things that we don't have and still need more of is work that looks at the very specific lives of women who have done the kind of activist intellectual work. And I want to use those two terms together, intellectual and activist. Why? Because we are pretty good, and this is not specific only to the Caribbean, of course. we're pretty good now in knowing who the men were. We know who the CLR Jameses were. We know who the Walter Rodneys and so on. But we really don't have a good sense of the Caribbean women who would fit that category of intellectual activists. And I want to put Andaye in that lineage for sure. So she's in the company of people like Audre Lorde, and Audre Lorde has done a similar thing with Sister Outsider, and Andaye references Audre Lorde consistently in her work. But if you look at Sister Outsider, and Audre Lorde has to be clear, I'm not one of those who works with the Caribbean only in sort of limited island or insular context, but the breadth of who we are across the range of our geographies, I want to say. So Audre Lorde then, Grenadian Caribbean, born in New York and so on, still actually ends her life in the Caribbean, still is active as a Caribbean woman. And she, in that Sister Outsider, really documents and does a similar thing to what Andaye does, and therefore gives us a kind of theoretical body of material. And I'm really happy to say that, because now you see scholars looking at her theoretical work, looking at Lorde as a theorist, right? The same thing I'm suggesting is what Andaye does here. The same thing I'm suggesting is what will become of this work, because now we have the work of a Caribbean female, somebody has a really nice hashtag, Caribbean female intellectual activist. We actually have now a recent contribution to that scheme. Okay, we can look at Sylvia Winter's work, and Sylvia is like very difficult because I talked with her about, Sylvia, you need to put together collections. There's one that's coming out from her students, but she never really spent time really putting together all her essays, right? As a result, if you're teaching her, as I did recently, you have to go from one text to the next and try to find a way to do all of them. So what we have with the Andaye then, and I've used it in my graduate course in Black Feminist Theories last year, is a ready collection of material which contains autobiographical material, the epistolary form which she uses, in other words, writing letters, and then that letter is carrying a series of theoretical and political discussions, right? The reflective academic essay as well is in there, and actually the lectures that she gave as well. So you have then a really nice range of material that one could enter from different points of view. And as I said in one of the interviews one of the reviews I did, the one for Small Acts, which I would recommend that people should find and read, because it really is a good collection. Basically, what she does there is actually bring forward to the next generation a whole way of doing what my students call the creative theoretical. We just had a conference on that last week. And therefore, Andaye then, in my view, becomes an active Caribbean intellectual activist who is able now to then give those lessons to another generation. And I'll stop there, I think, because we're supposed to give a little warm up first and then come back to more discussions.
Thank you, Carol. Over to you, Suniti. Thank you. I too would like to start by thanking Andaye for this piece of work, but also Alyssa, because I can well imagine what it took at that period in Andaye's life to be a partner, a carer, a partner intellectual, a journey woman in that process. It took a long time, and this would have been extremely important to her. And to be the person who is with you on that journey is a labor of love. I find in the book, well, I'm ecstatic to be introduced to her through this book, and to the variety of her personality and her engagement and activity. I think, like Carol, this work, and she states it, is for activists who are here in the field today. But I also feel it is especially for the women of Red Thread, her own organization. I think she wanted them to know and remember what they had done, the incredible things they had been part of, to retain their power in her absence, knowing that was coming, and to inspire them all over. They can go back to this book and read, or they can be inspired by what people are going to say about her, because no matter what happens, they will look to her as a mentor, as a leader, as an inspiration for all time. And I think that was extremely important for her. What is also incredible
are the elements of her life that she presents here, which I think we will discuss as the panel goes along. The girl, the activist, the person who is in a mental institution, the person who writes newspaper columns, who engages the public in the midst of an event, who has the courage to take on the power system, the person who attends conferences and gives very, detailed presentations, could stand up anywhere, who could astonish Anthony Bogues and company, and also a woman who has been raped, a victim of rape, and the openness, but also the easiness with which she opens her life. It's just one paragraph. She speaks about something that could be a whole book, but she mentioned it because there is in her work a self-effacement, but at the same time, a claiming of her power as a thing to be all the time. So I'm looking forward to this discussion as it goes along.
Lisa, your time.
Thank you, Honor. And it's such a privilege to be here with all three of you, who are encountering this book in different ways and different paths to Andaye. So Honor, who's one of Andaye's old friends, and in fact was one of the first people who got on our case, and my case particularly, to work on this book with Andaye over a decade ago. Carol, first encountered Andaye at a conference that I was also at in 1998 at SUNY in Binghamton, and has written with, and one of Andaye's childhood friends, who Andaye has also written with, Monica Jardin. And Suniti, you might not actually remember, but you were actually in conversation with many of us, including Andaye, when Norman Gervin was alive in 2013, when we joined the campaign to press CARICOM to take action after the Supreme Court decision of the Dominican Republic in relation to the revocation of citizenship for Dominicans of Haitian heritage. So there's a way in which she has actually touched all our lives. And I just want to open by saying it's such an honor to be here. And indeed, it was a remarkable journey for me to work with someone who really was my second mother, and who I've known for all of my life. And I just want to open by making sort of 3 points. One is to just tell the audience a little bit about the provenance of her name, Andaye, because I think it tells you something about what her politics was and the way in which that infuses the book. There are 4 ways in which she explains that name. The first is that there is no surname, it is one name. And so every time you had to fill a form out, it would throw people into crisis. Every time she met someone and she would say, my name is Andaye, they would wait for the surname. So even naming her, even calling her name, raises the question of what is normal. Even calling her name provokes a conversation and a discussion that gets us into trying to think about what is normal, what is natural, the things that we take for granted. The second is that it was also a refusal of heteropatriarchy and of gendered and class respectability in the context of the Caribbean. There's a way in which people say, what's your last name, which can be wonderful. But as we all know, it's also about who are your people? What is your place? Are you somebody that we need to know? And it's also a refusal of the father's last name, right? Or that you marry a man and you take the husband's last name. So refusing the father's name is also a demonstration of Andaye's sort of rejection of a certain kind of heteronormative respectability in the context of the post-colonial or neo-colonial Caribbean. The third one is the one that folks often sort of mark most of all, which is that the rejection of Williams, which is also the European imposed colonizer's name, and taking on of Andaye, which means daughter comes home. And she actually in the 70s, as many people did, opened a name book and went through it and found this particular name and meaning. And that was what became her name. So it was also within the context of Black power, within the context of, as she says, vomiting up this rage around the way in which as a Black child, a Black girl, a Black young woman, she was rejected, that she claims this name. But the fourth reason that folks often don't know, and that she speaks about explicitly in an interview she does with Audre Lorde in 1988, she tells us that in Guyana, when she was growing up, rural Indo-Guyanese women who were grassroots women would often have one name. For Guyanese, the most famous of those women is Kausila, who was an Indo-Guyanese woman who was a member of the Women's Arm, the Women's Progressive Organization of the People's Progressive Party. And she was actually killed at Plantation Leonora during a strike in the 1960s at the height of the racial disturbances. So Andaye's decision to just have one name, Andaye, was also a demonstration of racial affiliation in relation to African identity and disaffiliation in relation to crossing those lines to join up with working Indo-Guyanese women. So that's the first thing. The second point I want to make very quickly is that the book took well over a decade. Part of it had to do with illness, her diagnosis with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1989, the breast cancer that comes in 2011, the devastating effects of chemotherapy that left her with congestive heart failure and obstructive fixed lung disease. So illness was one. She had a fire in 2010 that destroyed most of her notes, her handwritten notes. So we had to reconstruct a number of things. The third is the fact that even if she wasn't ill and didn't have the fire, this book would have probably taken long because she was so exact. And, you know, for folks who haven't read the book, I have my editor's note is about the politics of precision because there was a particular politics to that. But she was really meticulous about language. And that also had to do with, you know, her love of language. She was actually enrolled in a graduate program in English at the University of Guyana and was writing a thesis that started out as a thesis on madness in the novels of Edwidge Danticat, Erna Broadbur, and Jamaica Kincaid. And she had begun to narrow it to just focus on Jamaica Kincaid. So there was that exactness as well. And the last point I want to make is that, you know, Andaye died exactly on the 30th anniversary of CLR James's passing on the 31st of May, 2019. And we celebrated her life on George Lamming, who's her good friend, on his birthday. In fact, in the middle of our tears, his voice boomed with delight over the phone when we told him we were going to cremate her. And her brother Abyssinian scattered her ashes in the Atlantic. And George was like, wonderful, that's my birthday. But the third point I want to make, and that's because Carol talked about how quickly this book came to fruition. Andaye signed off on this book. And that's the point I want to make here tonight. There was very little left for the rest of us to do. And my name might be editor, but folks, I could not have done this without the loving editorial work of Carol Laws, the incredible archival work of Nigel Westmus, the ancient wisdom of Ayusi Koyana, the advice of Wazir Muhammad, the friendship of Jocelyn Dow, the support of an entire network of folks and friends from Peggy Antrobus to Karen D'Souza, who was her right hand always. But she signed off on every single thing. Honors forward came in as she was in hospital, and I read it to her, and she said, brilliant. Well, I thought I would collapse because that is really superlative praise from her. Robin Kelly's came in and we printed it, but she was unable to actually read it fully. So the only things that she actually did not ever see or hold were Tony Bogues's afterword and my own preface. So I just want to say that she had really sort of signed off on it. In December, we had gotten the book reviews and we were told we had to cut 50,000 words. So I went back in April and we finished it. She was very in a lot of pain then. She couldn't even sit. She had to kneel on the floor and across her bed, but she was determined to finish it. So all that was left for all of us as her circle of support was to make sure that that book came to fruition. And Pluto Press and the series that it is edited by Bedura Lagra and Tony Bogues was just incredible at allowing us to bring this book out less than a year later. Thank you.
That's wonderful. And that's such a kind of profound moment of memory, Elisa. And I'm sure it was hard for you not to cry. So, because I know you're a waterworks. So thank you for holding it in. And please feel free to let out if you have to. But this question of memory is really important. And I wanted to pick up on that piece. Lisa started off by offering us some very graphic moments of Andaye's life and last days. But I wanted to broaden it out and to ask folks to think a little bit about what we do with these memories and what the labor of this kind of memory work is for us and what it is provocative of. I think it was you, Suniti, in the discussion we had before our pre-panel discussion, you talked about engineered amnesia. And I wondered if you could revisit what you said there. I think it's really important. And then maybe talk a little bit about what it might mean to trouble that kind of thing, to trouble amnesia.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, and the book is so full of this issue of memory and of erasure. There is this beautiful little description that Andaye gives at the beginning of going to school. And I cannot do better than just read a couple of the lines from that, where the children go to school and the teacher asks, what color is the sea? Brown, teacher, brown. Because they knew the sea and it was brown with the mud and silt washed down from the Amazon. The teacher says, brown? Brown? Is how you mean brown? Open your book on page 3, repeat after me. The sea is blue, the sea is blue. The sea is, children reply, blue teacher, blue. So they go later, we ran after school to look again to steer the dark muddy water and repeat in reluctant acquiescence. Blue teacher, blue. The sea is blue. And that thereby hangs a tale of the complete erasure of memory as we know memory is over that Caribbean civilization. And I see Bridget Burton is here, and for the work of history that she does, that is all part of the work of restoration of memory. That is the engineering of amnesia that takes place from the time you enter the education system. You are required to leave what you know at the door and to enter and receive and be the beneficiary of a version of the world and the received wisdom of somebody else. And you leave it and you leave what you may on your own, therefore also leave what you have been taught in the school at the school when you step out the door and you enter another world. And that is the world that we all inhabit, of multiple worlds, multiple realities, and the source of so much creativity, but also dysfunction. There is, and it is picked up again in the book with George Laming's, the character in George Laming's book, The Brother, who talks about, he says, you call it forget, was a complete wiping out from his memory. It's like how education wipe out everything. Now, Andaye knows, I mean, she would have had to select from so much material, but and this is what the book is about as well. She is pursuing, she's moving from the oral, also from the experiential into documentation. And that is the gift she has left. It's a gift of her life, of activity also, but then this is something in which we find through the various selections she's made, and I think it's really quite astonishing, the variety. The selection she's made, that you could just read this book alone for the experience of cancer. How do you go, who are you in going through that process? You could read it as well for the activist, and the piercing integrity of the work that she over and over, she comes to that point of putting her own life under so much scrutiny, because she is trying to tell us about the pitfalls that you engage as an activist, that you encounter in believing things that are not true, the betrayals, and that's when you get to the betrayals. But I want to come back to the point of, because you mentioned my involvement with Caribbean Yard Campus. I'm not the person, the organizer, but I'm a founding part of it. And it's the work that attempts to go back out of the school, back out of the schoolyard, into where knowledge is created. And it is not only teaching in an experiential manner so that, you know, the people who are learning are engaged, but also the validation and legitimization of the people who know things and who have never had a certificate right? It is that they know things, and we have to have the humility to recognize how much was created here before people started to go to school, much less to get to the point of university. Anna?
I hear you. I hear you. Carol, you want to weigh in on memory?
Yeah, I was thinking. I when you mentioned that phrase, Suniti, I liked it right away. Engineered amnesia, because it's something that is not just specific to the Caribbean. It's something that plagues a range of peoples who have been subordinated, because the logic is to keep you from that knowledge, because that knowledge leads to transformation, right? So what I love with Andaye's memory is that she has very specific selections. Memory, we know, is selective, right? But her selections are very definite, what she wants to include and what is included here. So relatedly, one of the pieces she had is about the normal corporal punishment of children. Stop beating the children, right? And it's something that is so amazing to me, because every year when you, for example, I teach Janice Shineborn sometimes in my Caribbean Worlds class, when we looking at a particular aspect of that plantation economy and so on. And one of the things you see is that logic of corporal punishment that we got from slavery, that we got from the colonial mode of teaching and so on, which still survives in different ways, right? And she's very definite about saying, you know, this is power. This is a power mood going on here, where the teacher is the one who is able to mete out all of that abuse to students. And of course, we know from the Caribbean experience that sometimes it's joined by the parental version of the same, right? So she selects very specific things that have to do with what she wants to remember. And I was struck by the fact that the example you gave about the sea is fascinating, because the first time I went to South Africa, and I was right in Cape Coast, where this Indian Ocean and the Atlantic meets, and actually one is gray, one is blue. So somebody decided that we will stick with that color blue approach, and then make that for everybody. So essentially, this is how colonial education worked, and this is how it seems, sadly, in the continuances that we have. We continue versions of that where we don't look at our reality and then see what that reality then gives our children, and then tell them the versions that you will find in the Caribbean of blue, different types of blue. And there are all kinds of ways that could be done. So I'm happy that she went in on this question of how we teach and what is learned, and how the children are asked to buy into a narrative, if even the reality outside of them is something totally different.
I mean, if I can just jump in here as well, you know, what's really important, and, you know, there's several places in this book, for example, in the Lucille Master Mayer lecture, The Angle You Look From Determines What You See. I think it's that essay. She invokes history. I think in the last one, which is the memorial lecture she gives, she invokes her good friend Kathleen Drayton's memory of being a child in Trinidad and Tobago, and hearing, you know, working people walking through the streets during the labor disturbances. And you know, this is something that, what is important, I think, always to remember for me in the context of this book, is the emphasis on the we. There is no space for an I that does not exist outside of relation and community. And so this comes out of a longer practice. You know, the essay or the book has yet to be written on what shape groundings actually took in the Caribbean and in a space like Guyana. There are hints of it. The person who has most done this is Ayusi Koyana. And in the essay on Walter Rodney, Andaye talks about how during the public rallies, he would often begin by telling people what plantation stood on the ground where the meeting was happening, and give them some of that history, as if to let them know that this was what ordinary people, working people, had actually made happen. That is part of the practice of a generation of folks. Walter is the one we know of, but Andaye, as we see in this book, that is also central to her practice. And it's central in the way in which, you know, so I love how you talk about how do you combat engineered amnesia, Suniti, by thinking through. Lloyd Best himself in Independent Thought and Wesleyan Freedom talked about the susu, right? So thinking about how do we center the knowledge and experience and wisdom of working people in their everyday self-organizing capacities. And so in this context, the women I would say she learned in relation with are the women in red thread. The ones there now, Karen D'Souza, Joy Marcus, Wintress White, Susan Collymore, Vanessa Ross, Hallie McCann, the other two ancestors who were founding, some of the earlier members of Red Thread, Joycelyn Backus and Cora Bell, after whom one of the drop-in centers for women for living income is named in Red Thread. But the way in which in Red Thread, beginning with ordinary women's lives, the time use surveys, the household budgets, is a way of coming to an understanding of their own knowledge practices and how that could become a particular kind of organizing tool. But let me just say, the preface that Andaye had, this was how it originally opened. And I just want to read this and stop. For all of us who want to achieve more than just rise as individuals, more than just lessen injustice and inequality only for our sector, whether that's women, whether that's LGBTQ folks, whether that's Black people or Indigenous people, just for our sector. For those of us who want to achieve more than this, the underlying goal is always to transform the power relations of the world. If this is true, then new generations of political activists never start new and should neither allow themselves to be weighed down by the past or to ignore it. And I just wanted to raise that because I think what's really important there is both that emphasis on history, those painful parts of it, as you pointed out, Carol, the colonial past and the baggage, the wonderful, irreverent, eruptive, rebellious, revolutionary parts of it, but also that we should not be beholden to the past and to tradition in ways that are deeply oppressive. So there's always that critical, reflexive approach to the past, that we bring it with us, but we also bring it with us and remake and reshape it within the context of the current conjunctures that we find ourselves in.
I think memory is important, not just, it's important because of it forces us to be reflexive, but it also forces us to see what tasks we haven't completed. So it's an instigation. The memories of particular acts of oppression, the memories of particular forms of violence kind of juke us into asking ourselves, are these still around? How are these still around? And how can we act on them in the present? So memory is not just about looking backward, it's also about looking forward. It's also about trying to figure out how we might want to transform. And I think, Andaye's work has to be taken up within the present context. And one of the tools that you mentioned just then, Alice, is a question of reflexivity. And this is almost a key aspect of her method. This is a kind of methodology of her work. Her thinking work is also action, and her action is based on this form of reflexivity. And if you compare this to her kind of calling out of the way in which politicians that hold power in our region often collude with the oppressive structures that they've inherited, I think we can see how different she is from that tradition. She's not afraid to say, I made mistakes. She is uncompromisingly self-reflexive, not just to be self-critical of herself or to sort of fetishize herself as a leader and make herself to big up herself, but also to look at what she says, in the intro of the book, that in fact, every aspect of our lives is implicated in political power, that political power sort of intrudes on every aspect of her life. So her acts of reflexivity are kind of a way of checking and balancing her sincerity, her accountability. She hated hypocrisy. In this, she's kind of like Louise Bennett. She hated hypocrisy, and she has, she could be scathingly dry, like Louise Bennett could also be scathingly dry and ironic. Everybody thinks of Louise as this sort of person who makes you crack up you read her closely, you see she's very ironic, very satirical, and I was too. No hubris there. No hubris there at all. She was relentlessly anti-racist all the time, calling out white supremacy and class privilege. But as Peggy, I think it was Nan Peacock pointed out, when you met her as a person, she was able to distinguish between who you were as a person and all of the systems that swirl around you in which you are implicated. So she wasn't distracted by your class or your race. She would cut right down to the question of where you stood in relation to particular politics. And she took what you were doing and applied her reflexivity to that as well. And I think that's where this business of making a particular kind of theory as a kind of strategy is really important, because theory of strategy in relation to our experience is something that is really critical. There is this gap between the amazing creativity of people in the region, and then this gap between that and what we're actually able to accomplish in the formal systems that we've created. And this reflexivity helps to offer us a tool to be able to begin to bridge that gap.
Actually, maybe if I could just say a few things very quickly in that. I think it's reflected in the structure of the book. You know, it took a long time for Andaye to figure out who this book was for, and that she talks about the Red Thread women as actually being key in terms of who she was writing for, the Red Thread women, their children, their grandchildren. But also the structure of the book is really important, because she begins the book with the critique. The book begins as a space clearing gesture, if you will, because she begins the book with critiques, which are also auto-critiques, right, of the women's movement, of the Working People's Alliance, of the left in the Caribbean. She opens the book with that. And in fact, the essay on the historic centrality of Mr. Slime, she actually gave that at a conference in Cuba that I think you were at, Honor. And that essay was originally titled, "When is the Intellectual Worker a Traitor to the Movement? And when are they of help to the movement?" I guess the three of us here, not so much Suniti, that's really, really important. But she opens the book with a critique of Caribbean feminism, which she's not outside of, with a critique of the Working People's Alliance and an emphasis on multiracialism that kind of glossed over the continuing legacy of racial divides among Afro and Indo-Guyanese, often to the extinction of any awareness or taking up of the concerns of Indigenous peoples in Guyana, and then a critique of the left in the Caribbean. Once she does that, we then get into the philosophy of care that really undergirds the rest of the book. But so the whole structure of the book begins with the reflexivity, that you have to be able to do that. And to do that methodologically requires humility, right? And it also requires a certain kind of accountability. And I think underlying all of this is, she writes somewhere else, the goal for her always is how to make our politics bigger. That was all it was ever about. How do we make our politics bigger? And the last day that she spoke in the ICU, she said to me, tell people that, because she was trying to explain why it took so long to come out. So it's interesting that you say Carla came out. She said to me, tell people that I was working over and over the book, adjusting and whatever, I'm not going to cry on her, adjusting and whatever to make one point how to change the world. Tell them I had no disciplining thought, just one piece of discipline, that you never restrict yourself to what is just in front of your face. You never restrict yourself to what is just in front of your face, what is familiar, what you think you know, what you think you understand. And as it's a literary festival, her favorite saying was always, language is the product and producer of change. So language and action, Lloyd Best would say thought is the action for us. Language and action for Andaye, those two things were inextricably co-constitutive.
Carol, I want to ask you if you could help us to understand this kind of innovation or this kind of way of taking up reflexivity in relation to some of the other women that you've written about, in relation to Francois or to any of the others that you've done work on.
Yeah, I at least I still need to say, Alyssa, although within the scheme of things, 10 years is still short relative to not knowing at all for 50 years.
That is
Really,
true.
I mean, based on my own work on Claudia, look at how long it took before this is a woman who did all of that similar kind of work, but still with the logic of change as well, and how long it takes us to get back to knowledge of them. So my point is that it is a very assertive political act to decide that what I have to say is valuable and it's going to be something that I will give to the world, that I will give to others, right? But on the self-reflexivity question, I was quite impressed that, and my students were as well. Keep in mind, I assigned this to class precisely because I had to write a review, and I was like, I'm going to do both. But not only that, for the Caribbean, there are not that many texts that one could use if you want to teach a Black feminist theory course and you want to give them the words of somebody who was an active participant in those struggles as Andaye was. So she carries both of them, I'm suggesting. But what was striking to them is, in terms of self-reflexivity, is that she actually talked about mental illness. She actually talked about having a mental breakdown. She actually goes into detail about what that experience was like, and for students who are coming through in this period where these questions are now raised in different kinds of ways, that's kind of, it's very advanced way of engaging self, as it were. But the point is still that, keep in mind, we don't have similar texts of people like Amy Ashwood Garvey. Amy Jakes Garvey writes about the Garvey movement, right? You don't really have texts about her until you have people writing that biographical work. So we still have few. I'm just saying, for me, as a person working largely in literary criticism and literary theory, we still are in the process of making, and I'm really pleased to have another addition to that collection, and also for that major reason that people know about Walter. Wherever you go in the world and you mention Walter Rodney, his name is known. He's known. But in almost all of the movements that have happened around the world in terms of decolonization movements, the women often did a lot of that groundwork, and Andaye clearly is one of those people. She describes in detail the kind of day-to-day work that she would do sometimes, and I'm not going to go into detail. You will read the book and see them. But the kind of work she did, the day-to-day work she would do in order to make sure things were running, that basic functions were working. So while we know about Walter, not taking away, and often when you say this, people think, well, these men were major figures and so on. We're not taking away from whatever they contributed. We're just saying that often there's a whole other spectrum of women who are doing all kinds of work to sustain and make sure these movements work. And Andaye is one of them. And I'm so pleased that she is able to be seen and heard, and therefore taken in different places around the world where people can understand that within the context of the activism that took place in Guyana, there were also women who were very significant to that movement. That's what I meant. Because when you hear about UNI, ACL, you hear about Marcus Garvey. You don't really hear about Amy Ashwood Garvey, who was a co-founder of the movement, right? So basically, unless the woman, and this is a basic feminist position, unless the women claim their story as valid and therefore give that story the life that it needs, it's not going to happen. And therefore, this is one of the things we celebrate by this work. And again, thank the Bocas Lit Fest for actually centering it in this way for this reason as well.
I think this question of the donkey work that has to happen in order to be able to center, the work is really important. Andaye was reflexive about everything. She was reflexive about herself. She was also reflexive about the women's movement, She was not afraid to call out any of us. In the time when I worked with her briefly or knew her, she was one of the most incisive critics of what any of us were doing. And I think she only came to like me because I wrote a piece called Ring Ding in a Tight Corner, which was critical. I think up until then, she held me in great suspicion and thought that I was probably one of a bunch of careerist, power-seeking women. But she really respected this ability for people to critique each other. But there's another piece of it that I think is important and that I think I want to acknowledge, and that the space for that critique has to be there. In other words, there has to be a place where you can make that critique, where that condition of resonance can come into being. And in a sense, there were a number of women who helped us to gain that space. It doesn't mean that we all agreed all the time. We didn't. But there were people who gave enormous amounts of solidarity, which enabled the space for someone like Andaye to speak and to speak critically and to call out things that she didn't agree with. And one of those people was Peggy Antrobus. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, Peggy, who is probably little known outside of a small circle, was a very important person in terms of giving people work when they couldn't find work in their own societies because they had said things that were not appropriate, or because they were considered dangerous, or because they were considered threatening. She managed to create a space in which people could work and engage and give a platform. It isn't that she was writing philosophical treatises like Sylvia Winter, but there was a space, there was an act, that there was a way in which she created a place in which people could meet. So there was a community of us that was happening regionally in the 80s and in the 70s, a community of us that was working regionally. People like Rhoda Reddock, people like Andaye, people like Karen D'Souza, people like Pat Mohammed, people, I don't want to go on calling names because I'm going to forget. And as I say, again, it's not that we all agreed or that we all thought the same way. It is that we were able to meet and quarrel and disagree and continue organizing in our different ways. And I think that space is a really critical space. And my fear is that the NGOization of the movement or the NGOization of almost everything that is social in the region has in a way blunted that kind of critical engagement. And when I mean, my students call it the industrial, I never can get it right, the non-profit industrial complex, or the industrial non-profit complex, which is this sort of kind of the equivalent of what would have been the colonial civil service, where, people who need funding for projects, because you need money to do things, apply to these places for funding, and then find that they have to fit what they're doing into the discourse that these agencies put forward. And I used to call it pimping. She used to call it pimping off the poor. And I think that's a very good description in a way of what it is. I wondered if you guys had any reflections on it. And I think that in a way, Suniti, your work and Lloyd's work was a real pushback on that kind of tendency, which has become so central in this, phase of neoliberalism. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you managed to do what you do without joining the industrial nonprofit complex, which also Andaye never did.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of like common sense that the things you believe in, you invest in, and it is never an option to say, I cannot afford to. I would like to be doing so. I cannot afford. You just invest your life. This is what people have always done, right? And but I also want to link a couple of things, because from that, she mentioned Haiti, for example, 5,000 or so, thousands of NGOs. And but we know what that is about. All these NGOs are running Haiti, and everybody has a different agenda, and everybody's running around doing something. And of course, it taps into all kinds of funding because there's no state. There is no state representative of the people and working, for their interests and so on. And that is the danger for those of us interested in changing the world. That is a danger that we face of coming to the point of separating yourself and finding your little corner as an NGO to get your little work done, because I believe in, adult literacy, I believe in children, I believe, and I'm going to do it because the government is not doing it. But the danger is that the government is very happy that you are doing that and removing the responsibility for them while they benefit from the entire revenue of your country and your taxes, and they have the right to pass laws. So wouldn't they just love that? So even if you're an NGO working, you really have to be part of the pressuring and working and organizing and joining forces to make governments representative of the things that you stand for, the things that are your life's interest. I think that I keep coming back to Andaye's integrity and honesty, because I think she was writing so much for the Red Thread women, because when you are in solidarity with people that you respect, you know that you are up for them, for their critique as well. And that is one of the errors of leadership, is that it gets so disconnected from the people it claims to be working for and to be representing, that they believe they can take people for granted. She held herself accountable to the people of Red Thread. She knew they will read this and they will know when she's not telling the truth, because they were there and she was there. And I think that would explain why she raises the accountability issue so early in the book. And she has probably been a harsher critic of herself than other people would be, because that is how you communicate and you keep the trust of people, that they see that you respect their intelligence enough to know that they're holding you accountable. Any leader that believes that they can represent people and keep them silent and they're going to follow them, I think people may give that impression, but you're always in for a surprise one of the days, when they're ready for you. And therefore, when we come back to the young people, the people who have decided what is the point but to change the world? What is the point of living, of life? What is the point of anything I have but to change the world? Because the world is not yet good enough. As simple as that. Whatever you think good enough is, you want to do that. That is why I think when she made that point that Alyssa mentioned, it was like she was a bit startled when Rodney would start off his public meetings, by talking about the place they were. Because that is to say, I want to tell you about this place and what happened here. There is a long story between you here today and something going back down to the past, and you are in this point now and you are going into the future. And that is why, don't just see the world in the context of what it is in the here and now. Don't just look at what is before your eyes. Memory is not just about remembering. Memory is the source of your inspiration. Women like you and with less than you have done so much. I am always inspired by Elma Francois. See? And I have to thank Rhoda for that, because I always think about her Condensed Milk Association, of the thing that was important to her, and she organized women around the price of condensed milk. Now that is a person who's absolutely empowered. And what is stopping you from releasing your power in the world?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that's it.
You know, the person that she was really close to as well was Selma James, who she met in 1982,
I got that. Yeah.
and who really had a formative influence on her. In fact, Selma's Sex, Race, and Class was one of the inspirations for Andaye's own book because, you know, she saw it as an organizing tool. And so Andaye thought these writings that she was putting out into the world were organizing tools that could be useful. That's what she was interested in. Could it be useful to other people? And if so, then in relation to the NGOization, Selma has a sentence that's really wonderful that I think captures what you're talking about there in terms of NGOization. She would often say ambition is the enemy of any movement. Ambition is the enemy of any movement. And I think that's a thread that we really see sort of running through this. And I think it was in the 80s or 90s when Andaye had a column in the newspapers in Guyana called Woman's Eye View. And she wrote a column saying, wanted a Guyana women's movement. Interesting, because we've always had a strong so-called women's movement. But when you scratch, you realize that like the rest of the Caribbean, they mostly come up through political parties. And so their capacity for independent, self-critical sort of is muted by that. And particularly on a context, the contemporary context, it becomes really impossible to speak. And so there's a way in which, you know, that essay, she talked about the difference between organizing to live, which is actually a term that she has come up with, organizing to live and organizing to rule. And she was like, you know, the problem is in the Caribbean, whether we're talking about folks who are now being funded by NGOs or folks who are in political parties, it's about organizing to rule as opposed to organizing to live, which is what I think, Suniti, you were speaking about. In Haiti, partly through her work across the Caribbean, but partly also through her work with the Global Strike, and in particular, Margaret Prescott, who is one of the founding members with Wilmette Brown of Black Women for Wages for Housework. Haiti has always been a really central dimension of Andaye's work. And so it comes across in several of these essays. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned that in your response, Suniti, and the way in which Haiti offers the clearest example across the Caribbean of the way in which NGOization destroys or attempts to completely destroy the creative sort of an autonomous critical capacity of people in the region. Wow, we have 12 minutes left. And Nicholas said we can go over by 30 seconds. So Anna, you got to bring this home.
Yes, so I want to turn to the question of care, but before I do, I want to sort of look at some of the things that have come up in the chat. I can't do all of them, but there's one comment from Ian Robertson that says one of the earliest manifestations of Andaye's critique of standard forms of education and colonial education, but it isn't that there's so much about colonial education that we haven't changed. It's still, our education is still so colonial. And he's writing that, you know, in her earliest manifestations of her kind of militance, she rejected the standard fare by shifting entirely to West Indian Lit when she was principal of South Georgetown Secondary School. Is that the job she got fired from?
Yeah, that's the job she got fired for. And she was part of a whole generation, right? Like Gordon Roller, Walter Rodney, they were at the other elite high school, Queen's College, and there was a historian, Bobby Moore, who started to bring in Africa, they think about the colonial history of the Caribbean. So there was a whole generation that was, you know, sort of doing this and experimenting. But yeah, this was the job that she was told that she had resigned. She hadn't actually resigned, but she was told she had resigned and was provided with her own resignation letter that she had in fact never submitted.
Wow.
That's another story.
It's a great distinction to be fired sometimes.
I know.
You know, I remember John Maxwell used to boast that he was the most fired journalist in the whole Caribbean, and it was a boast. It was a sort of signature of his value. There's a comment here from Peggy Antrobus saying that she wants to affirm the value of Andaye's critique and pointing out that anytime she made had an idea or made a statement, Peggy Andaye would reply, "Yes, Peggy, but."
Good.
Yeah. Now, there's something we haven't touched on, which was absolutely central to her work. We've come at it sideways through the reference to Selma James, and Selma James was influenced both in terms of both creatively and in terms of like stimulating provocatively, was has been mentioned by Elisa, and it was important in terms of the way that the politics of care got taken up by some of us in the early days, in the 70s and 80s. I'm thinking here of Joan French in particular, who worked with the domestic workers struggle here in Canada. I'm thinking of Sistren and our work around domestic labor, the plays that we produced about domestic labor and the relationship between domestic labor and low pay women's low pay. So there was that tradition. Going further back than that, you have somebody like Amy Bailey, who's organizing domestic workers and trying to professionalize it. That was another strategy that was used at a particular time, and also trying to get recognition for women in the professions. I want us to turn to the way that Andaye understood organizing of around care, and to ask folks to if they could sort of comment and talk a little bit about the significance of her ideas about what needs to be changed in the world through the notion of care. If we could think about the whole idea of change at this time a little bit in terms of her the significance and importance that she gives to care. And I'm thinking here of care in different ways. I'm thinking of care in the way that Suniti does it through the Yard campus, where she is caring for a particular tradition, and where the people who are working alongside her, I know that people like Royal Gibbons are involved. They're caring for particular traditions that they think are important, that might be wiped out by the sort of system that we live in if they were not, if we don't pay particular attention to them. So I'm thinking about care in that way, but also in relation to education. But I'm also thinking about care in terms of housework and domestic work, and the way in which that kind of labor gets value. I'm thinking of care in relation to mental health. I'm thinking of care in relation to what my students are always bringing up in class, which I always used to roll my eyes about: self-care. I'm thinking about this and the way in which they put self-care as an important part of activism. And they don't mean going to the hairdresser. They mean something different. So I think I want us to think a little bit about what might it mean to make care absolutely central to the ways in which we want to change the world. And I'm wondering what you guys might have to say about that. Nicholas is yelling.
One of the things that struck me, though, that I liked was that she talks about the kind of ongoing caring work that women give that is not remunerated at all. And for her, that the care has to be reversed in a sense, in terms of providing ways that people can have a good way of living in spite of it all. So to me, that is an important thread that for me that runs right through it. I like the fact that she, as defining a Caribbean feminism as she does, is also constantly putting in various components of it. And for her, it seems to me that would be one of the important components of it, so that one is able to not just theorize it, but to actually practice that and then demonstrate it and provide the avenues for people to live in a way that works. And then, of course, the self-care is another question, but that part of it is for me, and I'm the part of her contribution that really strikes me as somebody who did not know her, and I have to be clear about that. I'm coming at her as a scholar, looking at a text. I've met her, but she was not like a colleague or friend or any of those. I'm coming from the U.S. Howard kind of context, not the UE context. But in my sense of her very centrally defining a Caribbean feminism, and a lot of those pieces are critical to it. And that's what I wanted to at least leave with in my own reflection on what that care piece would mean in her work. So the praxis then of a Caribbean feminism having all of those pieces, the intellectual, the activist, the ways of looking at the colonial situation, the anti-colonial references, the anti-imperial references, and clearly the ways of engaging with communities that really are in need of care. And I think that for me would be some of the things that I would see essential to her framework.
There's a comment here disagreeing with what we've said about NGOs, saying that NGOs do the work that government should be doing, and we do it because no one else is doing it. Anybody want to comment on that in relation to care?
I think the NGO issue is so well documented. So,
Nobody's disagreeing with that.
there are people who create projects and do certain kinds of contributions, but largely it's a structure that is working outside of frameworks that can be held accountable. And I think that is the problem with NGOs. And I mean, Haiti is an extreme case, but there are several versions on the continent, in Africa and around the world in different ways where that NGOization is really criticized for what it does in terms of disempowering people from taking the lead and doing work, and then having an agency that comes in and also does the other parts of it. So I think the person is suggesting that it's sitting there fitting in between what government should be doing and what is not happening. Yeah, and that is the problem, isn't it?
I think there are good people in NGOs. It's not a question of whether the people who work for NGOs are bad people. Everybody's trying to earn a living. The thing is, what is it systemically doing? And how do you analyze what the total impact is? And I think it has really serious effects on the internal politics of groups. All of the social movements that we have been made, that have had a tremendous impact, have been made through One Cocoa Full Basket. Starting with, from Garvey to Buzz Butler to, even the PNP in Jamaica. So, I think that's the point. That's another point I want to make.
Yeah, and I think if because I'm seeing that Nicholas is asking us to sort of introduce the reading as we wrap up on care. I mean, the NGO question is a much bigger and wider question, and for folks who are interested, you can go on Andaye 1942 to 20-2019.com and look at the videos. She has one there where she talks about politics. So this is not at all, this is recognizing the very important work that the person who put the question out there, the comment there, that work is important. I think, as Carol and has said, the issue is to think through what does that do to politics, to mobilizing, to advocating, to self-organizing. And Andaye has a comment there where she talks about the fact that politics is now in the Caribbean about who will win the next election, as opposed to organizing in your community, in your yard, in your neighborhood, at your school, the kind of self-organizing that understands that ordinary people do remarkable, extraordinary things, and that we are the change that we have been waiting for. That's a cliche, but let me end with this love letter, which is also a statement on care, on a different kind of world based on different kinds of values, and on the love and support of folks in the Caribbean. This is a love letter for so many of you who are on the call and watching us right now. And I want to dedicate this reading to Joy Marcus, one of the Red Thread sisters, whose mother died before Andaye, was one of the earliest members of Red Thread. Joy shared a house with Andaye and still lives in that house. So Joy, Aisha, Yilani, this is for you. She's talking about how she was held up by friends and family during her last days with cancer. Joy was one of a small group of us who was with Andaye. Karen was actually the only one in the room with her when she actually died. It was in part redressed by personal and political friends and family who came with me to and from Barbados, to and from visits to doctors, hospitals, and labs. They made me welcome to stay with them in their homes or lent me their homes to stay in, drove me around or arranged for others to drive me around, made my bed, washed my hair, took photographs so I could see later how far I'd come. There I go. left me alone or kept me company as I needed, supplied me with special foods and complementary remedies, nutritional supplements and advice and books, cooked for me, one friend grumbling, I think that's Jocelyn Dow, all the while about women's work, which made me laugh, or corralled or paid others to cook for me, raised money or gave me their money, or employed me, that's Peggy, to do writing jobs with long deadlines, that's the Andaye school in Barbados, which I could complete by working on my good days. It was redressed in large part by women, some of them strangers, who organized medical help for me in countries where I was a stranger, who mobilized what they called an international healing circle of women in my support, by women and men who came together in nightly gatherings to eat, talk, argue, and drink, who sent emails or cards, who phoned, visited, and prayed, one telling me laughingly what a fraud I was because while I didn't pray, I was willing to use other people's prayers, who made me laugh even when they didn't mean to, like the one searching for how to help me build confidence that I could beat non-Hodgkin's, urged me to take a herb which another woman she knew with cancer had taken, me. And how is she now? She. Oh, she's dead. That carried me for days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. And thanks to our audience for listening and for participating. Walk good, Andaye, and make you walk with us.
Thank you.
Louise Bennett Coverley, better known as Miss Lou, was a beloved writer and performer who changed the way Jamaicans think about their everyday language. The new anthology 100 Plus Voices for Miss Lou collects essays, poems, and more, paying tribute to the cultural icon. In this installment of our required reading series, editor Opal Palmer Adisa tells us why Miss Lou remains so vitally important. Part of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest's 4 Days to Change the World.
Hello, I am Opal Palmer Adisa, a writer, a cultural activist, and a gender specialist. And it really gives me great pleasure to be introducing you to 100 Plus Voices for Miss Lou, the newest anthology that I've edited, a tribute to Louise Bennett, the cultural icon, the poet, the performer, the pantomime, the Miss Extraordinary. And it's just, if I must say so myself, a wonderful collection of poems, tributes, interviews, and essays about Miss Lou, for Miss Lou, in honor of Miss Lou. Miss Lou means a lot to me as a writer and as a reader because she really gave me permission to write in the Jamaican Nation language. And I say Jamaican Nation language rather than Patois, which is what a lot of people refer to the Jamaican language as, erroneously. But I believe what Kamau Brathwaite say, that it is our nation language, it is our mother tongue. And when I was in school, we were not allowed to speak Jamaican Nation language in school. We could actually get a detention for doing so. And so it was reading Miss Lou and listening to her and seeing the joy and the breadth of her knowledge in writing poems and performing in the Jamaican Nation language that gave me permission so that all of my poems and stories insert the Jamaican Nation language. Louise Bennett's poems have influenced and inspired my writing, but have also influenced and inspired dub poetry. In fact, the poet, dub performer Muta Baruka credits Miss Lou, and in fact, he says that she is the first dub poet. So those are high commands, recommendations from her. It's very hard for me to say which is Miss Lou's favorite, which one of her poems are my favorite. There's several favorite: colonialization in reverse,
especially now as we talk about a republic. But I think my all-time favorite is Jamaica Woman, not woman, but woman. She doesn't put the W there because we wouldn't say it in that way. And what I like about that poem is her feminist stance, is her understanding of the times. And of course, it was written way before feminism, became a buzzword. And it's the way Miss Lou understands Jamaican woman. She says Jamaican woman talawa, and talawa is a word oftentimes attributed to Nanny, our heroine, but it's a word that means small but mighty and strong. And in that poem, she chronicles how women have to be, in a sense, subterfuge in order to show and be as strong and diverse as we are. So I would say Jamaican Woman is one of my favorites of Miss Lou's poem. Her words and her poetry and her pantomime, her plays are still relevant today, not just for Jamaica, but for the entire Caribbean. One of the things I know is that I've spoken to many people throughout the Caribbean, Eastern Caribbean, as well as the other Caribbean islands, and they are familiar with Miss Lou because she was part of the curriculum. And I would imagine that she will continue to be part of the curriculum for hundreds of years to come, because Miss Lou was a cultural icon and a cultural activist, and her poems really document what was happening in Jamaica specifically, but which reverberated throughout the Caribbean. So her relevance in terms of validating who we are and our culture, validating how we think and how we move about in the world is so important. A lot of us are not familiar with Miss Lou's war poem during World War II and the poems that she wrote that spoke about what was happening abroad, but specifically how it was impacting Jamaicans and by extension the Caribbean at large. So Miss Lou, Louise Bennett, Copley, is really a voice for Jamaica, but in truth is a voice for the Caribbean, is a voice for the world, for people who should take pride in their language, take pride in their culture, and big up themselves, as we would say in Jamaica. I want to now read a few excerpts from this collection. As I said, it's a tribute of poems, essays, and interviews. I want to read excerpts from the first section, or the foreword. Lorna Goodison, Jamaica's national poet laureate, ex-poet laureate, knew Miss Lou very well, and in fact lived in Gordon Town on one of Miss Lou's property. And so she has some choice things to say, which I think is important for readers to know. She says, "Thus it was that little Louise Simone Bennett said to herself, 'These people are good people, so they cannot talk bad. These are nice people. They are kind people, so the way they talk cannot be bad.' And just like that, Louise Simone Bennett found her purpose in life. The good people, many of them women, would come to Louise's house to see her mother, Corinne Robinson, a dressmaker whom Louise called Love. She called her maternal grandmother Mimi. Her father, Cornelius, a baker, died when Louise was a small girl, but all her life she'd remember the stories he told her." So that is in the foreword by Lorna Goodison, and allow me to read another towards the end of the foreword by Goodison. This is what she says, and I think it's really important that readers hear this. "Louise Simone was granted the gift of poetry, and with it came the conditional role of freedom fighter. For just as Nanny of the Maroons bounced bullet from her body, Louise would have to spend years chucking off the wrath and condemnation of the gatekeepers of society, including many of the people she was defending, who brutally attacked her for championing Jamaican speech." And for me, this is such an important acknowledgement by Lorna Goodison, and such an important acknowledgement by those of us who love Miss Lou. And then in the same section of introduction, in my own introduction, I just want to read a small part of what I said about her. I first read Louise Bennett's poetry while studying in New York, and it was only after my undergraduate degree that I began to study her work seriously. My mother applauded this approach and remarked, "I see you find your way home." My mother typed all of my poems that were published and that were published in the Sunday Gleaner. Her love and praise for Miss Lou never waned. And it was my mother who really first made me listen to Miss Lou when she came on the radio. And she'd always say, "Shh, listen, Miss Lou is coming on." And my mother would just laugh uncontrollably and tears would roll down her eyes listening to Miss Lou and the knack Miss Lou have of saying things and the way in which she made bad things turn to laughter. In also the section before, there are two very important introductory remarks by P.J. Patterson, our former Prime Minister, who knew Miss Lou very well. And again, I want to read an excerpt of one of the things that PJ says about Miss Lou in terms of first meeting her. So he calls her a formidable woman. And this is what he says. Miss Lou was very caring and patient, particularly towards younger people, but she hated formalities and did not entertain anyone who was pompous or who pretended to be other than they were. I was very comfortable in her presence. So this is what P.J. Patterson says in meeting Miss Lou for the first time. And then this is what he says, and again, very important. I think she will forever remain an icon for her creative skills. She was a heroine first for what she did to build the confidence of the Jamaican people. Particularly at this time, as we are passing through the challenges of COVID-19, something she wrote in an early poem should be a source of inspirational comfort for us. And I'm going to quote the poem he quotes. Sun a shine, but things no bright. Pot a boil, but bickle no enough. River flood, but water scarce. Rain a fall, but dirty tough. In cultural preservation, in the culture of Jamaica and the Caribbean, this provides a document, and it's a tribute to Louise Bennett, who fought for us to ensure that nation language is heard, recognized, and celebrated, and that who we are at our most ordinariness, if I might use that term, is a gift, is of value, is of truth, and is of celebration. So please, I invite you to pick up 100 plus voices for Miss Lou, because there are over 100 contributors to this volume. I am Opal Palmer Adisa. Thank you for listening.
Your bow, Mr. Fiddler. Oh, ha, hi. This country so colorful and truly diverse. We're doing our best to put TNT first. Youth success through advancement. We encourage. We proudly supporting the rich cultural heritage, promoting development in the sporting arena, and empowering women for equality of gender. We sustaining the environment and strengthening the society. First citizens helping paint, uprighter, TNT. Drag your bow, Mr. Fiddler.
One Caribbean Media renews its support of the Bocas Lit Fest with sponsorship of the 2022 Bocas Lit Prize. As the festival journeys further into its second decade, we recognize the tremendous effort and innovation that has gone into fostering a community of Caribbean readers, writers, and mentors. As this community grows, we take pride in recognizing the excellence of its members and do not hesitate to support their development through this continued partnership.
Novelist, historian, political philosopher, CLR James has shaped 4 generations of Caribbean and global thinkers and activists. A new biography of this Caribbean icon explores the connections between his restless life and his wide-ranging work, a chance to consider what James means for us today. Now, biographer John L. Williams joins scholar Aaron Kamukisha for a conversation about James the writer and James the man, part of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest's 4 Days to Change the World.
Good evening. I am glad to be here on the opening night of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. My name is Aaron Kamkisha, and I am joined here by John Williams, who has done a remarkable new biography of CLR James called CLR James, A Life Beyond the Boundaries. And I'd like to say, first of all, on behalf of NGC Bocas and everyone who's out there, welcome, John.
I'm really pleased to be here virtually. I only wish I was there in person, but yeah, you can't have everything.
Indeed, indeed. Yes. So let's get started with a question which you actually bring up in towards the very end of the biography. And that's the basic question of how you met James, or how you first encountered James, his work, James the man, and the pathway that led you towards actually writing this biography.
Okay, well, I was in my early 20s. I was, a typical. I wasn't a student at that point. I'd been working in a anarchist printers in Cardiff, and with older people who'd read a lot of politics. And one of the names, they threw all these names at me, most of which went straight over my head. But one of them was CLR James. And then I was watching a TV documentary about the Jamaican poet Mikey Smith, and in the middle of this documentary, he and Linton Kwesi Johnson go to meet this old guy upstairs in some house in Brixton and start talking to him about, well, they want to talk about dub poetry, and he starts schooling them in kind of Shakespeare and Wordsworth. And I'm thinking, who is this kind of gray-haired sage, And it turns out it's this CLR James guy that I've vaguely heard of. And I thought, well, I've really never seen anyone like that on my TV in Britain before. And so I went out and I read Black Jacobins, which completely, was a history that was so unfamiliar to me at that point. And, the way it centered kind of Black resistance rather than kind of Black oppression was, was great. It was just so inspiring to read. And then I was also a big cricket fan, and someone told me, he also wrote a book about cricket. I don't think they were sure that was a good idea, but I kind of sought that out. And when I read Beyond the Boundary, it completely, the way it showed the way in which, Britain had changed people in the Caribbean, but the Caribbean had changed Britain. Cricket, this most English of games, had been completely changed by being exported to the Caribbean. And by the time it came back to Britain, it was something else again. And this, I just thought, it just obviously doesn't just apply to cricket, it applied to everything of how the world is post-colonialism and how we change each other. And I just, it just made me both rethink everything I knew. And I just found it really inspiring. And I was, from that point on, just, a James fan, if you like. And it started there. I read more of his stuff over the years, and eventually I got to an age where I have written a few biographies. And I was looking at the books there were on him, and there's lots of really interesting theoretical work about him, but nothing that really told you the story of his life. And looking at the dates alone, 1901 to 1989, it's what you think that's a hell of a life. So much must have happened. And I felt old enough and stupid enough to think, let's try and tell that story. So that's basically it.
Which actually goes on to the second question I was going to ask. With all that has been written on James, I would think that from my vague analysis, there are at least 12 single authored books, probably another 10 or so edited collections, and that's besides the huge number of essays, the different ways in which James has been taken up. I mean, James is one of the great world thinkers of the 20th century. I was going to ask you, why then another book on James? Why another book on James right now? But I'm getting the idea that you thought that there was something biographical that had been missed, that most of the ways in which James had been taken up had been through the lens of scholarly study, while you wanted to actually bring a more human side perhaps to James, or a different type of side, perhaps. More.
Exactly that. I mean, within the academy, James is a huge figure, and he's like an area of study in his own right. And yet outside the academy, he gets reduced to a stereotype, I guess. He's some kind of wise old Black Power guy or something. I feel there's no subtlety and depth to to people's understanding of James outside of the academy. And also, I just I'm fascinated by people, really, in a way, more than, I'm not really an ideological thinker. I'm fascinated by the realities of people's lives, what they do, how they do it. And I felt that you know, in the case of James, there had to be so much there. It just had to be an interesting life. And then I started work on it, and you think, gosh, the places he went, the kind of the ways he changed himself over the years, from being a literary young man in Trinidad to being a Trotskyist in the north of England, to being a kind of to almost completely reinventing Marxism in New York in the 40s and 50s, and then coming back home to Trinidad and trying to work with Eric Williams at the beginning of independence. There's just so rich, really, and so full of human drama. There's love affairs, there's car crashes, there's a whole mass of stuff. And I just wanted James, if you liked, there's fun in James, there's humor in James, and the Academy is great, but you also I wanted to write a book that I hope will make people who aren't in the Academy read about it and think, God, what an incredible life, and make them think, and then actually go and read some James, because that's the point, I guess.
Well, certainly. And as someone who's read and researched a great deal on James, I was absolutely fascinated at the level of detail, including the personal detail that you managed to mine for your book. And I was wondering if you wish to discuss this with us further, and on two levels. One, the question of the interviews you conducted, and secondly, on the question of the archives. And we can leave the archives for now, and I could just basically ask you about the actual interviews that you conducted.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he's been dead 30 years, so most of the people I spoke to, knew him in later life and knew a particular version of James, which was the teacher more than the writer, and almost the legend, if you like. He would hold court in Brixton in his last years, and people would come and sort of pay homage. And that's a very particular sense of James. It was hard to find people who went back that much further, but with a bit of work, for instance, his niece and nephew, Erica and Henno, his brother Eric's children are in Brooklyn. And I went to talk to them, which gave me great insight into how what the family was like. They talk about how formal and Victorian they were in the going to their grandfather's house in the 50s. It was really like stepping back into a previous age of kind of Victorian gentility. So it was amazing to meet them. And then there were people. I met one of his Trotskyist group in New York, the Johnson Forest Tendency. I found a woman called Isa K. Mexin, in her 90s, who still had, very clear and actually in her case, perhaps slightly troubling memories of James and so on. Yeah, it kept. I mean, in a way, also in the last years, you had a complex living situation where he was essentially looked after by the Race Today organization, particularly by Darcus Howe and his wife Layla Hassan Howe. But he also had a secretary, Anna Grimshaw, who was a kind of middle-class white woman. And, you see in that instance, people had very different memories of who he was, if you like. You realize that it's a bit of a cliche about James, that everyone has their own CLR James. And that's normally applies to people who read CLR James and take some particular message from his work. But it also really applies to people who knew him, that, there were so many sides to the man that, one person would see one side and the same person the next day would see a different side. So and as a biography, you have to try and pull that together and try and, find a way through that shows as much as you ever can, the whole, the richness and roundness of the man.
Indeed, very much so. And as you said, it's a very long journey from 1901 to 1989, and it begins in colonial Trinidad. And I was thinking that this might be a good time for us to go to one of your readings. I believe you have a reading prepared for us, which is on that particular period that I'm sure viewers would love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not about his childhood, which is so brilliantly covered in Beyond the Boundary, which people, perhaps more likely to be familiar with, where he talks about growing up and particularly about cricket. But I'm going to take us to his early 20s when he's teaching at QRC and just, starting to make his way in the world. And in particular, okay, I'll just take it from there. While his interest in cricket has come to be the best known aspect of CLR's life and character, it did not define how he thought about himself at the time. He illustrates the sport's significant but minor place in his pantheon by listing all the English magazines he subscribed to at the time, a list that also gives a marvellous picture of the young Caribbean intellectual. Not only the Cricketer, but the Times Literary Supplement, the Times Educational Supplement, the Observer, the Sunday Times, the Criterion, the London Mercury, the Musical Review, the Gramophone, the editions of the Evening Standard when Arnold Bennett wrote in it, and the Daily Telegraph with Rebecca West. Not content with that list, he also added from France, the Nouvelle Revue Française and the Mercure de France, and from the USA, the Nation and the New Republic. He presumably didn't pay for all of these, but read them at the public library, where his lifelong friend Carlton Commer would order in whatever publications his peers wanted to read. Gradually, CLR began to make friends with other young men of similarly intellectual bent. First and most important of these was a Portuguese Creole called Alfred Mendes. Years later, CLR said that, "If I have to single out a single individual in the Caribbean with whom my life was inextricably bound, then Alfred Mendes is the person." Much later, he summed up the mutually beneficent nature of their relationship neatly. "I can't say how much I owe to Mendes. All I can say is he probably owes as much to me." Alfie Mendes was only 4 years older than CLR, but by the time they met in the early 20s, he had already had an extremely eventful life. His father was a wealthy man, having made good in the provisions business. Following his mother's death, Alfie was sent to an English boarding school for a couple of years before the outbreak of war led to his recall to Trinidad. In 1915, though, he joined the merchants' contingent and went off to Europe to fight. He spent 2 years in Flanders as a rifleman, a bona fide war hero who won the Military Cross after one particular operation of foolhardy bravery. He was finally invalided out after inhaling poison gas. His wartime experiences provided the inspiration for his grandson Sam Mendes' film 1917, a century later. Back in Trinidad, Alfie met his first wife, Jessie. They married, had a son, and Jessie died of pneumonia, all within 2 years. In 1922, he married his second wife, Juanita. Meanwhile, he was working for his father and starting to write. In a society as compact as Port of Spain, it was inevitable that two young men of letters like Alfie Mendes and CLR James would meet. CLR made an immediate impression. He stood about 6 feet 3 inches, as lean as a pole, and possessed the kind of rough charm that women of all complexions succumb to so easily. His intelligence was of the highest order, his memory for music and literature phenomenal. All of this was seasoned with a sharp wit and a sardonic sense of humour. Mendes noted that while CLR was very clearly a Negro, he always assured me that one of his forebears was a European, French as my memory serves me. He also observes that as a teacher at QRC, CLR was immensely popular, teaching English and history with a style so austere and at the same time so colourful that his pupils listened to him in thrall. It's an observation that suggests that the key elements of CLR's speaking style were in place well before he ever left Trinidad. For his part, CLR was simply delighted to meet someone as fanatical in their love of literature as himself. He was particularly impressed that Alfie Mendes had his own library. His father had bought in the house at 45 Richmond Street when he married, and he had since added on an extra room to house his library, which already ran to more than 2,000 volumes, mostly novels and poetry. The two men started to meet regularly. After he finished teaching, CLR would cycle down to the Mendes business premises, and together the two friends would head back to Alfie's house and settle down in his study. Countless of the hours I spent there, CLR later recalled. Together they would read the literary periodicals, order the books they read about, and then discuss them. Mendes, being the son of a wealthy father, he bought more books than I did, but I don't think there was any great gap between us. Indeed not. CLR's healthy salary enabled him to start on a prodigious book-buying habit, one that would carry on throughout his life, even at times when he was living in the most straitened of circumstances. When it came to assessing life's essentials, books always came first for him. Mendes and James's friendship saw them exchanging letters on a daily basis, despite the fact they saw each other most days and lived in the same town. Few of their letters survive, but a sprinkling of those written by CLR give the flavour of their friendship. They address each other by their surnames as per the public school code. The earliest surviving letter dates from December 1925 and begins, "Dear Mendes, I return the 2 books I borrowed last evening. before going on to discuss Thomas Hardy's The Dynasts. CLR comments that, unfortunately, I have neither the time nor the energy just yet to give a book like that the attention it deserves. Reading such a book is a landmark in one's literary life, and I'd like to see a few days clear before me. CLR's letter also asks for feedback on something he's written. How do you like my sketch? It's rather annoying of me, I admit, but I'd like to hear your opinion on what I have written. You know how isolated you can feel in this God-forsaken hole. Further letters see him sending Mendes volumes of Chekhov stories and a work by the Austrian Schnitzler. Gramophone records, an exciting new phenomenon, are exchanged too. CLR had a gramophone in his room. Mostly they swapped classical music, Beethoven, Brahms, Debussy, etc. Though on one occasion CLR has to apologize for not sending back a recording of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue because a lady borrowed it. This is about as forthcoming as CLR ever was in referring to his many relationships with women. His published writings, when they touch on the matter of sex at all, tend to see him presenting himself as an upright Puritan, a prisoner of the strict moral code of his upbringing. The truth was generally a long way from that. As Alfie Mendes suggests in his pen portrait, CLR spent a lot of energy in the pursuit of women and continued to do so throughout his life. If you want to know more about that, you'll have to read the book.
Indeed, thank you very much. And that takes us straight on to the other part of my earlier question, and that has to do with the archives. Now, there are major James archives in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. It's a very major James archive there. There's also a collection of papers at Columbia University that contains some very important work. There's also the Wayne State Archive, which I believe has Martin Glaberman, a close associate of James and Johnson Forrest tendency. And I believe that contains a lot of the papers of Glaberman. I believe also Grace Lee Boggs' papers may also be there. So those are the three major archives that most Jamesian knows. I was amazed at the extent of the research that you managed to do, the letters, the various things that you managed to pull up that most scholars have not really engaged with before. I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on the archives that you use, the relative merits of the archives, what you found the most compelling for the story that you were trying to craft, and something also about the time period across which you collected this work.
Okay, yeah. As you say, those were the three main archives. There are other smaller archives that I use, but let's keep to the big three, if you like.
Oh, we want to hear about those ones, smaller ones.
Well, we'll start with the big three. I spent a week in the Columbia archives, which are huge, and I've box after box after box, and all the time you're guessing, because you can't. Literally, a week was not enough to see everything, so you're continually hoping you're picking out the right boxes and the right files within the right boxes. But there's a lot covering the whole life in Columbia. One thing that's different, there are probably more photos and tapes and so forth in Columbia, and there's a lot of stuff I'd love to, had I had time and money, I'd love to have listened to a lot of the tapes, but you can't do everything. Yui in Trinidad was again a huge archive that spans the whole life. There's so much there. I spent a week there, just getting there the second it opened, leaving when they finally kicked me out, and and very much the same thing. I mean, I think I knew those two were going to be great. The one that surprised me was Wayne State. I wasn't sure whether there was going to be very much there at all. But the Martin Glaberman archive is an absolute goldmine, because Glaberman kept all the correspondence between the Trotskyist group, the Johnson Forrest group, over sort of a 30-year period. And within that, there are, and also the linked archive belonging to Lyman and Freddie Payne. And particularly the letters to Lyman and Freddie Payne, are much more personal than a lot of CLR's, a lot of these letters, you've never seen anything like them. They're like bigger than A4, and they're not even single spaced. They're like half spaced. They're just, he's cramming in so many, one piece of paper will probably have 3,000 words on it. They're incredibly hard to read, and I was destroying what was left of my eyesight, speed reading these things, photograph, if in doubt, take a photo. So I was, thank God for the camera phone and how good they are these days, because I was just going click, 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 click. But yeah, the letters to the Paines in particular, CLR really opens up for someone like me who's trying to find out what he was doing in his life apart from writing books. Those letters were invaluable. So yeah, I think I got an immense amount. Again, it was a full week in Wayne State. Yeah, those are the big three. I mean, there's Constance Webb's letters in the Schomburg in New York. There was there's some more stuff on the Trotskyist stuff in that NYU. In London, the Senate House has quite a good Caribbean collection, which had some interesting letters, particularly with Norman Manley, who and CLR's friendship with Norman Manley is a great little story in itself, really. And it's one of you could probably write, if not a book, quite a slim book about that friendship. There's so much to unpack in it. Yeah, there's an archive in Fullerton in California, which no one else seemed to know about. Someone in the 70s had gone and interviewed a whole lot of CLR associates, including a mysterious fellow whose name called Willie Gorman, who CLR thought was the most brilliant of his proteges, but was also an extremely troubled individual. And I'd never heard Willie Gorman speak, but there's a tape of him conducted in a park for some reason, and it sounds like he's kind of undercover. But yeah, that was a little surprise extra. And of course, down in San Fernando, there's the oil workers have got a nice archive of CLR's letters from the year or so he spent there at the beginning of the 80s. And one lovely thing there is they've got his book collection with just the books he had acquired, essentially, I think, while he was there. And again, it's a wonderful mix of everything from Proust to Lenin to Freud, and his correspondence from that time when, on a personal level, you can see that he's writing a lot. He's finished teaching. He'd been teaching in Washington, D.C. for the previous decade. And he was clearly missing that interaction with people. So he's writing long letters to students all the time, full of just, care, talking about people's living situations. He's offering kind of grandfatherly advice to all these students, which is, again, a side of CLR I'd never have come across, really, if I hadn't gone down to San Fernando. Yeah, that'll do.
Oh, no, that's incredible. And all of this investigation, this work in the archive, it took place over what period of time? I'm trying to get a sense of the amount of time you spent researching the book and then compiling this all together. And especially since you've written a number of biographies, I was wondering a little more if you could tell us about that process of creation of the biography and the writing of the biography, which I think everyone will find very interesting and compelling to hear.
Okay, well, I mean, the short answer to the research period is probably 2 years. I mean, not non-stop, but there's about 2 years spent essentially assembling things that, I start with the written sources. So everything, every book I could get, I bought or borrowed from the library and read. And next was the active research. I interviewed as many people as I could. Then I went to the archives. I think that was the next stage, partly because I had to raise funding to do that, as obviously it's expensive spending time in, the States and Trinidad. But got that together, and I think I ended up spending a month in the States and a week in Trinidad. I wish I'd had longer, but such is life. And I got in just before COVID, which was a miracle, and at that point, well, two things happened. First, I had everything, really. I felt I had everything I needed. I'd come back with, literally thousands of photos of documents from the various libraries. And at the same time, lockdown came in, and I was worrying at this point. I was thinking, I've spent too long on the research. I'm never going to get this thing written. But lockdown, one thing lockdown's a blessing for is biographers with a deadline, because while everyone else is, sat indoors thinking they wish they could go out, I'm sat indoors living somebody else's life. So, I'm moving from Trinidad in 1900 to, Britain in the 30s, to the Caribbean and back and forth. And it was a fantastic way to spend lockdown. Really what I do is, I've read is to start at the beginning, really. Go back to the beginning of his life, read everything I can find that relates to like the first 10 years, and then write that part. And at that point, and repeat with his teens, his 20s and 30s and so forth, as much as possible to try and identify with how he would have been feeling at each time, not using too much hindsight, trying to think, well, at this point, when he leaves Trinidad, age 30, this is what he knows. This is the kind of person he is. So now and they're trying as much as you can. I've also written fiction, which may or may not be helpful. But I'm quite used to the idea of putting yourself in someone else's head. And in a way, that's what I've tried, as respectfully as I can, to think, if I were in that situation, why is he doing this now? And I think, well, this is probably why. One thing I would say that I think maybe people miss about CLR James's life and his books is that he never had any money, because he never had, he didn't have an academic career. He didn't even have a degree. He was entirely a freelancer. And as someone who's also been a freelancer essentially since they were in their early 20s, I kind of know that feeling that, that you're writing, but things get written or don't get written depending on whether there's actually any money coming in that week. And I think, there are projects that you wonder, why did he abandon this project or that project? And the answer is actually pretty simple, because he needed to do something else to earn the money. So to that degree, I feel like I was able to bring something of my own experience of the writing life to a story of somebody else's writing life.
Okay, thank you. And in many ways, James is known, perhaps sometimes most widely, as one of the greatest Marxist theoreticians of the 20th century. And his meeting with Trotsky is one of the many remarkable parts of the book that people are aware of, but often they don't know the human story behind it. So I was wondering if you wanted to give us a reading on that meeting with Trotsky in Mexico in the late 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely. The meeting with Trotsky had been loosely set up for early April, but was put in jeopardy as CLR's time on the road had led him to a physical collapse. Word of this reached Trotsky himself, who wrote to offer his advice. It is my opinion you should devote the next months exclusively to the care of your health, if necessary even postponing the projected book on the Negro question. As I understand it, you suffer from a stomach ulcer. In this condition, your trip to Mexico represents, I say it with the deepest regret, a direct danger. Everyone, even those who have sound stomachs, suffer from stomach trouble here, and those who have it abroad suffer doubly and triply in Mexico City. I know it from my own experience. Your ideas for the Negro organization and the Negro paper are very interesting and important, but the first condition is the re-establishment of your health. I love the whole idea of Trotsky dealing out health advice. CLR, though, was not going to let a stomach ulcer stand between him and the opportunity to meet his political hero, and he set out for Mexico. A Spanish-speaking comrade called Charles Curtis was on hand to escort CLR to meet the old man, as his followers called him, on the 4th of April 1939. Trotsky was living in the Mexico City suburb of, I'm going to pronounce this horribly, Coyoacan, in La Casa Azul, Frida Kahlo's home since childhood. It had been turned into a fortress due to the very real threat of assassination by agents of Moscow. Inside the fortress there was a further line of defense composed of Trotsky's devoted and unflinching revolutionary followers. By the time CLR arrived, however, it was also a household in some turmoil. Trotsky and his wife Natalia were in the midst of moving out. Frida Kahlo and her husband Diego Rivera had been Trotsky's main sponsors on his arrival to seek asylum in Mexico in January 1937, but it had become a complex relationship. Trotsky and Kahlo soon embarked on an affair. She called him Piochitas, little goatee, referring to his white beard, or less affectionately, El Viejo, as he was twice her age at the time, 57 years to her 29. Ironic too, given that Trotsky's nickname to his admirers was the Old Man. Oddly, it wasn't the affair that caused the Trotskys to move out. It had come to an end when their respective spouses discovered it. It wasn't even Frida Kahlo giving Trotsky a self-portrait for his birthday and him hanging it above his desk in the study. Instead, it was Rivera and Kahlo's move towards Stalinism. That was a betrayal that could not be ignored. Given the circumstances, it's remarkable how focused Trotsky was in his discussions with his latest visitor. But then Trotsky's life had been lived in extraordinary circumstances for decades, and while the threat of assassination was real, it was hardly new. CLR was very struck by finally meeting Trotsky. This man, whose writing had transformed him from would-be bourgeois novelist to ardent revolutionary, turned out to be something of a surprise. His manner and style were those of a European nobleman of the 19th century. There was nothing proletarian or Bolshevik in the crude sense about him at all. Furthermore, he had a great gift of languages. He would speak in English if necessary. When he was in trouble for a word, he would use the French word, pick up the English word. His wife was very handsome, very gay, very stylish, and the whole household worked extremely well, centering around him and his activity. They were a really striking pair and very different to what I'd expected a leader of the Russian Revolution to be. The two men spent several days together, debating in particular the Negro question. Trotsky was already convinced that this was an area in which the SWP were failing to make headway. CLR had prepared well, writing a document detailing his thoughts on the matter. It's a remarkable piece of work coming from a man who'd been in the US for barely 6 months. He'd evidently spent his time in Harlem productively, getting to understand the Black American mindset, one very different from that of the Black Trinidadian, let alone the Black Africans he'd met in London. Black Trinidadians like CLR had grown up under the colonial yoke, but they lived in a majority Black culture without formal segregation. Black Americans, on the other hand, in many ways felt themselves to be an oppressed nation within a nation. The successful Black protest movement had capitalized on that feeling. Marcus Garvey had offered a crude Black nationalism with a promised land over the ocean. The white radical left only offered sympathy and the promise that if you join and help make a socialist revolution, then you will be free. Black and white, unite and fight was a slogan leftists liked, but in practice, Black Americans weren't listening. CLR had thought hard about this and formed a radical plan. He argued that Black Americans, thanks to the oppression they faced, represented potentially the most revolutionary section of the population. He didn't believe that Black Americans would happily join a white socialist organization, however noble its aims. Black Americans needed a Black-led movement, one that would work alongside the SWP, but couldn't simply be a puppet body controlled by senior white theoreticians. This was a brave submission. Trotsky and Lenin before him believed in the key role of the vanguard party. The masses needed clear-eyed leadership from above to take them to the socialist uplands, in which they would in time come to political maturity. To offer a section of the proletariat, in this case Black Americans, this degree of self-determination was frankly unheard of. Much to his surprise, though, CLR found the old man to be in almost complete agreement. Trotsky accepted the idea. We discussed it for 3 or 4 days, and there was very little difference between him and me. We ended with the idea that the thing we had to do was to urge and in every way do what we can to create a Black movement that would fight for its democratic rights. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how confident he was to go to have this kind of debate with, you know, the great worldwide leader of revolutionary communism.
Certainly. And I think that James would say later in his life that he thought that his American years from 1938 to 1953 were his most productive years. And certainly that there is a huge amount of work, editorials and various articles that he published under the pseudonym J.R. Johnson and various other pseudonyms at that period of time. And of course, his very great work, Notes on Dialectics, which he later would say in a 1980 interview when he was asked what was his most important work, he said Notes on Dialectics. Now, many of us who are James scholars and Caribbeanists would demur a bit because we tend to think that the rival merits of Beyond the Boundary and the Black Jacobins are some of his principal and most important work. And certainly what he achieves in England in those 6 years he's there from 1932 to 1938, he manages to work and write and produce at an astonishing pace. However, really, in many ways, for persons in the Caribbean and in Trinidad, it's James's sojourn back into Trinidad when he returns to Trinidad after 26 years abroad in 1958 that still evokes a particular memory of James's actual presence within the region. And I'm hoping that perhaps you could give us another excerpt on that particular period, which many of us find so compelling in terms of his battles with Williams and what he's trying to craft for Trinidad and the Caribbean about a new society emerging out of colonialism. So yes, if you could give us a reading on that, I think that we would be most obliged.
Great. I mean, I may have to lead into this a bit because the reading I've got is more about his being reunited with his family. I mean, there's a couple of things I'd like to say, maybe though, about the return to Trinidad.
Well, certainly, yes.
Yeah. Because he was invited effectively by Eric Williams, and quickly Williams, because he had been Williams's teacher at QRC, they had been friends in London and in the States. I mean, to the extent that when CLR's son was born, CLR's wife Constance, at the birth, Eric Williams was holding one hand and CLR James her other hand, so they were that close. Bill, he used to call him, and. And a lot of, James's ideas are present in Williams's early work in Capitalism and Slavery. CLR James had a big influence on helping Williams shape that book, and the idea of the Woodford Square open meetings were, I think, clearly inspired by James's increasing fascination with ancient Athens and the way that democracy had worked in ancient Athens, with people talking in the marketplace. And so at the point James returns to Trinidad to help Williams, there's, I think, a great interest in this man, this Eminence Grise, who people, they knew the name, but he'd been underground in the States for so long that, it was a long time since there'd been a book. So people had a sense he was some kind of revolutionary, but they were very curious to find out, what the man was like. And at the same time, CLR, for his part, was very curious to find out what it would be like, coming home after so long. So I'll read you something about that. There's a newspaper photo of CLR James on his arrival at Trinidad's Piarco Airport. It was the first time in a long while the press had taken sufficient interest in any of his doings to send a photographer. There are three men in the picture. The tall CLR is flanked by two shorter figures, his brother Eric and his old friend, the library chief, Carlton Comer. CLR himself looks thin but animated in a light-coloured suit and his Royal Deluxe Stetson. The reason for the interest was essentially curiosity. The vast majority of Trinidadians knew nothing of CLR James. Those who knew most about him were his contemporaries, for whom he was an enigma. The brightest boy in Trinidad, who had belatedly gone to London and published books, as he was destined to, but had then all but vanished. There were rumours as to what had happened. He'd gone to America. He was a communist, an outlaw. The rumours weren't the reason for the newspaper photographer, though. The important thing wasn't that CLR had returned home after a quarter of a century. It was the matter of the man who'd invited him back. He'd come at the invitation of the new chief minister, Eric Williams, aka the Doctor, the man who was going to lead Trinidad to independence. Word had it that CLR James had taught the Doctor at QRC. Apparently it helped him with his big book, Capitalism and Slavery. It was the Eminence Grise come home to advise his protege. So that's why the photographer was there, to see what an Eminence Grise looked like. CLR had arrived with plenty of plans to talk to Eric Williams about, but he wanted to start by seeing his family for the first time in decades. His brother was the only exception. They'd met up a few times in the 50s in New York and London. Eric James was a significant figure in Trinidad, both the chief accountant of the Trinidad Railways, a job for which he'd already received an MBE from the Queen, and secretary of the Trinidad Football Association. Even though it was late in the evening, Eric took his brother straight to their father's house in Tunapuna. CLR described the reunion in a letter to Lyman Payne soon afterwards. We went down to the Old Man that night and reached there at about 2 o'clock. He was very glad to see me and I was glad to see him. He said, well, it's a long time. And he practically said that he didn't think he would see me. But there I was. We had a big meal. He had a bottle of champagne. And it's very difficult for him to be up so late. Perhaps a surprise, perhaps not, was his discovery that Robert James, the original Old Man, was still working. He lives in a good house, a house he built when he retired. He has a school of some nearly 60 pupils to whom he gives commercial lessons, and they sit for the English examination and pass. They come to him from all parts of the neighbourhood, some of them 20 miles away. He has to turn some back. He is, however, quite old. He was 81 on July 15th, and the strain on him is very great. But he can't help it. He must continue with the school because that's what he lives by. There are obvious resemblances between father and son. Like CLR, Robert seems to go up and down in mood and health, and like CLR, he had a much younger female helper. He took a turn towards real old age about a year or two ago, and when he goes out now, he has to go with a stick. But his mind is still as lively as ever. He talks by the yard to me, telling me all the old stories and a whole heap of new ones. The other day, he picked up himself and went off to the races with his assistant. She's a young woman of about 30 whom he taught, and she became an assistant after she passed her examinations. She's been with him for 14 years. The other person who had been with Robert since his wife Bessie died, also 14 years earlier, was CLR's sister Olive. CLR was quickly aware that of the three siblings, she had drawn the short straw. Olive is a wonderful person. She is 56 and her life has been spent first of all nursing my mother when she was struck down with a stroke, and afterwards taking care of my father. She's an old maid, but she has very few of the characteristics of an old maid. She dresses herself very well, and she has a good head. You will pardon me if I quote someone as saying that Olive has the James brain. When I left here, she took little interest in politics. Now she's as acute in analysis and as capable in gathering up information about the general political situation and the situation in her own neighbourhood as anybody I've met. She and my father, I regret to say, are reactionaries both. They are on the opposite party, though they deny it. I would win over Olive without a doubt because she has always believed that I am the most wonderful brother in the world. And now I have come back, we start off exactly where we left off. But the essential thing about Olive is that she's a good woman, a fine person, recognized as such by anybody who knows her. There is nothing mean or cheap about her, and her general responses to things and her sentiments are practically always fine. That is despite the hard life she's lived. I hope to goodness I should be able to give her a trip to England. My father says that he will give her the money to go any time. But of course he says that, but he will be very put out if Olive left him, though he makes a great show. And I'm afraid he persecutes Olive quite a lot. That, however, is by the way. At 81, he is entitled to his idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, and I mean, the nature of that passage and what James is actually saying brings the inevitable question, which runs throughout the biography, of your position on James's gender politics. And I'm talking about the relationships that he sees within his family, his interaction with his assistants, his relationship with his the woman who he did fabulous intellectual work with over the years, and his own personal relationships. Based on what your research uncovered, what kind of comment do you want to make there?
Well, it's a complex subject, as most people's relationships to the opposite sex probably are, if one's honest. But I would say one thing is he certainly talks a good game, and I think in his writings, right back to the beginning, his first short stories and his first novel, Minty Alley, his portrayal of the women in the barrack yards are extraordinarily sensitive and empathetic. I think there's, you can see that he's a man who loves women and takes women seriously. And I think that carries through, in his political life. He consistently worked with strong, brilliant women. In New York, his closest associates were Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, who are both, very strong women. And he absolutely, gave them their head. There was no sense that, he pulled rank as the man in the group. And right through, till in his 70s and 80s, when his role was much more as a teacher and lecturer than as a writer, really. He was very impressed by the wave of feminism of the 70s. Particularly, he was excited by the new wave of Black American women writers, Alice Walker in particular, also Toni Morrison, and Zaki Shangi, I think, was a particular favorite. So yeah, I think, and his politics, his political views always saw the revolutionary potential of women, none more so than in the work of his third wife, Selma James, who he encouraged to write about the lives of working class women, for the Trotskyist group. So to that extent, I would say, you'd give him, he was exceptionally ahead of his time in his feminism. In his private life, he didn't always live up to those standards. I think he liked to present himself as a sort of a very buttoned up English sort of person, but the reality was he was something of a womanizer, really. I mean, to put that in context, one should say that he was an extraordinarily, tall, good-looking man, extraordinarily charming. I'm sure that there were any number of women who were very attracted to him. And, it's easy to criticize people's womanizing if you're not actually having to fight people off on a daily basis. So, that said, there are one or two instances that crop up in the book where I think he came to take it almost for granted that any woman he met would fancy him, and that there's at least one occasion documented in the book where he went over the line, really, and in a way that I'm sure he knew at the time was wrong. And certainly in he left his first wife in Trinidad when his work took him to England. He left his second wife, Constance, when they'd been married for 2 years and had a baby son, and he left her for another woman. So, it's he had, and during his third marriage, he had affairs as well. So, yeah, I would say in his writings, absolutely great. In his personal life, like many of us, maybe he didn't live up to, all the standards he set himself.
I mean, I think that there is a longer story that we can't explore right now on James and his encounter with questions of gender in the 1950s, partly also because there are some very prominent Black woman feminists who are in the United States and who are in radical circles at that time whose work he basically does not engage with and ignores on some level. Then part of that, of course, is Trotskyist Communist Party politics, and it's complicated, and there are many other things we could say there. But I want to return back to this question of the Caribbean and the impact of James on a Caribbean intelligentsia, because I think it's one thing that you mention, but perhaps it's not played right through in the book. You certainly speak about Norman Manley and the remarkable exchanges that they have, but I don't recall seeing as much about James's lectures at the University of the West Indies campuses, and thinking about that relationship then, and that mentorship he had with figures like, let's say, Norman Gervan, Walter Rodney, yes, certainly, but also figures like Norman Gervan, Lloyd Best, particularly thinking about that Trinidadian context, and what that actually meant for another generation of Caribbean intellectuals who certainly are going to be very prominent from the 1980s into about the first or even the beginning of second decade of this unsettled 21st century.
Yeah, to be honest, I partly put my hand up here and saying, yeah, that it's, I mean, obviously there are, you can't get everything into biography, but I was aware that there was more there, that I haven't covered that, that period in as much depth as I would ideally have liked to. I talk a bit about, I mean, after he was basically, cut long story short, he fell out with Williams in the early 60s. He came back to London. And at that point, he started a kind of study circle at his home in London with a lot of young Caribbean students, including people you've just mentioned, and that was, that was inspirational and important. He was really giving them kind of seminars on revolutionary Marxism, which I think, made a huge impact. And he would carry that through, as you say, into his lectures later on in the Caribbean. I don't really talk about that so much. I talk a little bit about his talk. But he comes back to Trinidad and starts the Workers' and Farmers' Party in 1965, where he makes his one slightly disastrous attempt to be an actual political figure, to put himself up for election, and that didn't work well. And I think he realized that he was essentially, apart from anything else, just too old to really cut it as a as a politician on the stump in Trinidad. So, and he literally went from failing that election to going to Canada, to the big assemblage of Black revolutionary thinkers, and I think at that point he realized that teaching, his job now was to inspire the next generation, that he could no longer see himself as being the, in the forefront, that he needed to take a back seat, but make sure that the new generation, were informed by all that he'd learned in his, in his 60 years at that point.
Indeed. Yeah. And I mean, I think that there's an immense amount covered in the biography, and certainly one can't cover all. But that actually raises a question for me. And I'm moving towards also a conclusion now, given the time. But what's your hope for audience for this book? And also, could you reflect further on to me? Is this going to be the end of your writings on James? And if so, what are your new future projects that you hope to engage with?
Okay.
So intended audience and future projects.
Right. Well, I just think James is a fascinating character, and everyone should see that he has something to offer. Anyone who's interested in the state of the world, which I'd hope is really everyone. I think that his life, what I hope the biography does, well, on one level, is simply to tell a really quite an exciting story, but also to make you think about what can you do with your life. He never allowed himself to be limited at any point by what people might expect of someone like him. He hits London in the 1930s and he absolutely takes it by storm. His self-confidence is extraordinary and inspiring. So I would hope that this is a book that will appeal to people, let's be realistic, people who maybe heard the name CLR James, but maybe have an image of a kind of white-haired sage in their minds, but that's essentially it. I think this is a book that will tell them there's so much more to him and make you think about wherever you're from, really, what you can be, what you can do, in a way, what is a life for? And I think James's life asks you that question again and again. So, yeah, that's what I hope. In terms of what I'm writing, after our biography, I'm slightly decompressing. I've just started writing a comic novel set in a radical bookshop in London in the 1980s. Who knows where it'll go, but it's nice to get back into fiction. And I'm considering writing a book about Paul Robeson's time in exile in England in the late 50s and early 60s, which is quite it's a strange, in some ways sad, in other ways inspiring story that I don't feel has been told again. And I'm starting to think about that and to think whether I really want to spend several years in that story or not. We'll see.
That's always a question. Can you actually maintain your interest in the story enough? And I can tell that James, of course, is a topic who has maintained your interest for a good 30 odd years or so. And I think it's fantastic that we have this biography available. So I'd like to move towards a conclusion by saying, John, thank you so much for your time here and for this biography, which has given us so much to ponder. And thanks to all of you, our audience, for attending this session of the NGC Bocas Literary Festival, our opening evening. And please do continue to come to our sessions over the course of this festival. So thank you and good evening.
Thanks.